My wife threw me out of the company I built from nothing after believing her new intern's lies. 5 weeks later, she asked if I had reflected on my mistakes. Instead, I handed her divorce and resignation papers, and she completely lost her mind. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Frederick, 70 years old, and a man who learned the hard way that blood does not guarantee loyalty. As a software engineer who built a highly secure data logistics empire from my garage back in 1982, I thought I had secured my family's future. I was wrong. The security guard's grip on my bicep was tight enough to restrict the blood flow. I stood in the glass-walled lobby of Vanguard Data Logistics, the exact company I had built from a single rusted server rack. Now, 40 years later, 2 men in cheap tactical uniforms were marching me toward the revolving doors like a common criminal. Patricia, my wife of 42 years, stood directly by the main reception desk. She wore a tailored designer suit purchased entirely with the dividends of my sweat and sleepless nights. Beside her stood Connor. Connor was 26, white, possessed a generic business degree paid for by my daughter, and held the title of our new logistics intern. He was also my son-in-law. "Hand over your physical keycard right now, Frederick," Patricia commanded. Her voice echoed off the polished marble floors, ensuring the 50 employees standing in the open bullpen heard every single word. I looked at the woman who had slept beside me for over 4 decades. "You are removing the chief operating officer based on a spreadsheet fabricated by an intern who barely knows how to format a basic cell." "Connor is not just an intern," Patricia snapped, taking an aggressive step forward. "He is family. He ran a full system audit on the server expenditures. He found the shell accounts, Frederick. You have been siphoning company funds into a private offshore account for 5 years to hide money from me. When he confronted you this morning in the server room, you physically assaulted him." I turned my gaze to Connor. He stood slightly behind Patricia, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive dress shirt. He offered a quick, arrogant smirk that Patricia could not see from her angle. I grabbed his wrist because he was plugging an unauthorized flash drive into the primary mainframe. I stated, clearly projecting my voice so the witnessing employees could hear the absolute truth. He was attempting to download the proprietary routing algorithms I wrote myself. The financial audit is a complete smokescreen to cover blatant corporate espionage. "Stop lying to my face," Patricia shouted, her face flushing with intense anger. "You are a bitter, outdated man who cannot handle the fact that a younger, sharper mind found your amateur mistakes. You have always been too rigid. You refused to accept those massive corporate buyouts in the late 90s because you thought nobody was smart enough to touch your code. Now you are stealing from your own family just to maintain control. Your own daughter agreed with this decision, Frederick. Vanessa signed the legal proxy authorizing Connor to audit your private files. She sees the damage you are causing to our future." The mention of my daughter hit me harder than the physical grip of the security guards. I had bought Vanessa her first computer. I had taught her to write code at our kitchen table. I had fully funded her Ivy League education. Now she had handed her proxy to a man she met 2 years ago to help destroy me. "You are suspended pending a full federal legal investigation." Patricia continued, her voice dripping with venom. "Go home right now. Reflect on the humiliation you have brought to this family." The employees in the bullpen stared at me in absolute silence. I had hired half of them straight out of college. I had paid for their medical treatments out of my own pocket during the last economic recession to ensure no one lost their insurance. Now they watched my wife strip away my authority as if I were a dangerous stranger. Connor leaned forward, whispering with a tone wrapped in false sympathy. "We can handle the workload without you, Frederick. It is time to let the next generation take the wheel." I looked at my son-in-law, a boy who had never written a single line of functional code in his entire life, trying to claim ownership of my life work. I realized immediately that reasoning with Patricia was utterly impossible. She was blinded by her ambition to modernize the company and completely manipulated by Connor's flattery. Defending myself in a screaming match would only give them the chaotic reaction they desperately wanted. I did not yell. I did not beg for my dignity. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the gold-rimmed keycard, and dropped it onto the reception desk. The plastic clattered loudly against the hard marble surface. "I will go home," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "But you will quickly realize that removing the foundation causes the entire house to collapse." I turned and walked out of the building. I did not look back at my wife or the gloating intern. The security guards released my arms the moment I pushed through the revolving doors. I stepped out into the crisp morning air and walked toward my vintage truck. I chose tactical silence over a public scene because I knew anger was a worthless emotion. Anger clouds judgment. I needed absolute surgical focus. I recognized that the physical building was lost to me. The desks, the chairs, and the glass walls were temporarily under Patricia's control. But the true value of Vanguard Data Logistics did not reside in the real estate. It resided in the digital infrastructure. The digital war had just been declared. I climbed into the driver's seat of my truck and locked the doors. Before I could even insert the key into the ignition, my private mobile device vibrated violently in my coat pocket. I pulled out the heavy encrypted phone I had custom-built for personal network monitoring. A flashing red notification filled the screen indicating a severe unauthorized security bypass on the secondary firewall. I opened the live server logs. Connor had not retreated to his desk after I left the lobby. He was currently logged into an administrative terminal using a backdoor password he must have stolen from my daughter. Connor was not running a financial audit. He was actively bypassing the data encryption protocols. I watched the green lines of code scroll rapidly across my small screen. He was initiating a massive data transfer. He was downloading the master client list, the proprietary shipping manifests, and the encrypted contact information for our highest-paying logistics accounts. He was routing all of that priceless data to a masked external server. My own son-in-law was stripping the company of its most valuable assets while my wife proudly defended him in the lobby. My family believed they had successfully ousted an obsolete 70-year-old man. They believed they held all the power. They made a catastrophic miscalculation. I started the engine of my truck. I did not drive toward my house to reflect on my actions. I drove straight toward the financial district. I had to secure my personal assets and hire the most ruthless cybersecurity firm in the state before Connor could finish draining my life work. The screen on my phone blinked again as a second alert appeared. The unauthorized download speed was accelerating. Every second I wasted meant another loyal client was exposed to a thief. I merged onto the highway, gripping the steering wheel tight. Patricia thought she had removed a tired old man from her perfect corporate vision. She did not realize she had just unleashed a man who knew exactly how to dismantle her entire reality. I parked my heavy vintage truck outside the First Fidelity branch downtown. The engine ticked softly as it cooled down, completely oblivious to the impending disaster. Every passing minute allowed Connor deeper access to the Vanguard Data Logistics mainframe. I needed to hire a ruthless, independent cybersecurity firm to sever his connection remotely, and that required immediate liquid capital. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the bank and approached the first available teller. I handed her my platinum debit card and requested a wire transfer of $200,000 to a secure escrow account. The teller swiped the card. She frowned at her monitor. She swiped it a second time, her fingers tapping nervously across the keyboard. "Sir, your card is declining," she murmured, actively avoiding my eyes. I did not raise my voice or show frustration. I simply asked her to manually input the account number. Before she could touch the keys again, Marcus, the senior branch manager, hurried out of his glass-walled office. His face was pale, his posture rigid with obvious discomfort. He ushered me into his private suite and closed the heavy oak door. "Frederick." "I am so sorry," Marcus began, keeping his voice remarkably low. He slid a thick stack of legal documents across his polished desk. I glanced at the top page. It was an emergency court injunction. Patricia had not just fired me from the company, she had filed a devastating legal motion claiming I was an immediate flight risk who had embezzled corporate funds. The judge had signed it barely an hour ago. Every single personal checking account, joint savings account, and corporate credit line bearing my name was completely frozen. Patricia had severed my financial oxygen supply before I even left the company parking lot. She intended to leave me entirely defenseless. I kept my hands perfectly still on the padded leather arms of the chair. I did not show Marcus a single ounce of the anger boiling in my chest. I simply looked him directly in the eyes. "Marcus," I said, maintaining a deadly and measured calm. 30 years ago, I walked into this exact building asking for a commercial loan to expand my server farm. Your predecessors laughed at me. They refused to lend capital to a young African-American engineer with a technological vision they could not comprehend. I did not walk away in defeat. Instead, I pointed out a fatal security flaw in their localized network architecture. I personally rebuilt this bank's entire digital infrastructure from the ground up, protecting millions of dollars from external breaches. My diligent work is the specific reason this branch survived the massive cyber attacks of the early 2000s. Marcus swallowed hard, wiping a thin layer of sweat from his forehead. He knew the history perfectly well. He knew my flawless professional record. "I know exactly what you did for us," Frederick Marcus replied, his voice strained with genuine regret. "I know you are not a corporate thief, but my hands are completely tied by the law." Patricia brought a high-powered legal team into chambers this morning. They presented the judge with a fabricated financial audit bearing the Vanguard Company seal. "Until you can prove those documents are forged in a court of law, I cannot legally authorize the release of a single dime from your accounts. If I bypass the injunction, I lose my career and face severe federal charges." I understood his precarious position perfectly. Loyalty rarely survives the immediate threat of a prison sentence regardless of past favors. Patricia had weaponized the legal system against me with terrifying efficiency. I stood up to leave, accepting the harsh reality of my frozen financial assets. Before I turned the door handle, Marcus held up his hand. He looked nervously out the glass wall to ensure no employees were watching. "Frederick." "Wait a moment," Marcus whispered urgently. He unlocked his desk drawer and pulled out a second, much thinner file. "Because of what you did for this bank, I am going to show you something I am legally prohibited from disclosing to anyone." He slid the confidential file toward me. I opened it carefully and read the very top page. It was a formal withdrawal request submitted just 30 minutes prior. Someone had attempted to liquidate my private untouchable retirement fund and transfer the entire balance to a newly formed limited liability company. The printed name on the transfer request was Connor. I stared at the signature line. Connor had absolutely no legal authority to access that specific account. But right beneath his name was the authorizing signature of my daughter, Vanessa. She had maliciously utilized the emergency medical proxy I granted her 5 years ago when I underwent a minor heart procedure. She had legally authorized her husband to drain the very last of my life savings. The realization struck me with the devastating force of a physical blow. Patricia's betrayal was born of blind ambition and arrogance, but Vanessa's betrayal was a dagger straight to the soul. I had spent countless nights teaching her the value of integrity. I had shielded her from the harsh realities of the cutthroat corporate world. Now she was actively helping a man she had known for barely 2 years destroy her own father. My daughter was not just a naive bystander blindly following her husband. She was entirely complicit in the intentional execution of my complete financial ruin. I closed the folder and handed it back to Marcus without uttering another word. The sharp pain of my daughter's betrayal immediately calcified into cold, impenetrable armor. I thanked Marcus for his dangerous indiscretion and walked out of the bank. The bright mid-morning sun felt incredibly blinding as I stepped onto the busy concrete sidewalk. I reached into my leather wallet and counted exactly $40 in loose cash. It was the only liquid capital I possessed in the entire world. I walked toward my parked truck. Before I reached the driver's side door, the heavy encrypted phone in my coat pocket rang loudly. The caller identification displayed the name of Robert, the Chief Executive Officer of Global Supply Chains for a major international retailer. Robert was my oldest and most lucrative client. I answered the call. "Frederick, what on earth is happening over there?" Robert demanded, his voice thick with unbridled fury. "My entire security team just received an emergency alert. Our proprietary shipment schedules and encrypted freight routes are suddenly populating on a public dark web forum. You swore to me Vanguard Data Logistics was impenetrable." I checked the live server logs running in the background of my phone. Connor had not just stolen the client data for his own use. In his arrogant incompetence, he had exposed the raw database to an open network while attempting to mask his digital footprints. He had initiated a catastrophic data leak. If that data reached the open market, it would completely destroy Robert's supply chain and invite billions in federal lawsuits. "I am fixing it right now, Robert," I stated firmly, offering absolutely no excuses or apologies. I ended the call, sliding the phone back into my pocket. I could not fight this highly sensitive digital war from a public bank lobby. I needed a completely untraceable computer completely off the grid, and I needed it immediately. I drove my vintage truck away from the financial district and headed toward the industrial east side. I pulled into a cracked asphalt alleyway and parked behind a rusted corrugated metal door. This was Maxwell Electronics. Maxwell and I had met in 1978. We were 2 young black men trying to break into the emerging tech industry. When venture capitalists laughed us out of their boardrooms, we pooled our savings and built our first servers from salvaged military surplus parts. Maxwell never cared for the corporate spotlight. He preferred the quiet hum of his chaotic, dusty repair shop surrounded by mountains of obsolete motherboards and tangled copper wiring. I walked through the heavy door. The smell of burning solder and stale coffee hit me instantly. Maxwell looked up from a microscope, adjusting his thick glasses. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I placed my $40 on his cluttered workbench. "Patricia threw me out of the company this morning," I stated firmly. "She aligned with Vanessa and my new son-in-law to execute a hostile takeover. They froze every single bank account I own. But that is not the immediate crisis. Connor is currently inside the Vanguard Data Logistics mainframe. He is dumping highly classified client manifests onto the open web to mask a massive data theft. I need an untraceable terminal. I need a rig completely disconnected from modern commercial networks, and I need it right now." Maxwell did not ask a single unnecessary question. He looked at the $40, pushed it aside, and stood up. He walked over to a metal cage in the back corner of the shop. "Let us build a ghost," Maxwell replied. We cleared a space on a heavy wooden workbench. For the next hour, we worked with absolute synchronized precision. We did not use store-bought commercial laptops. We cannibalized parts from discarded commercial servers and wired them directly into a stripped-down motherboard. Maxwell soldered the physical connections while I manually coded a completely localized operating system on a separate drive. We needed a machine that possessed absolutely no digital fingerprint. I connected our makeshift terminal to a series of encrypted proxy servers Maxwell routed through an old satellite dish on his roof. Once the physical rig was stable, I began the digital infiltration. Vanguard Data Logistics possessed the most formidable corporate firewall in the state because I was the man who built it. I knew exactly where the structural blind spots were located. I typed lines of code into the black terminal screen, weaving my way past the primary security gates. I bypassed the two-factor authentication protocols without triggering a single internal alarm. My pulse remained entirely steady. I was no longer a discarded husband or a betrayed father. I was a digital architect walking through the invisible walls of my own fortress. Within 20 minutes, the terminal screen flashed green. I was in. I had secured a completely undetected backdoor into the central nervous system of my company. I opened the live administrative logs and mirrored the exact screen Connor was currently viewing from the executive suite. I watched the raw data stream across my monitor. Maxwell pulled up a chair beside me, handing me a mug of bitter black coffee. "You are officially invisible," Maxwell stated quietly. "Now let us see exactly what your son-in-law is trying to steal." I focused my attention on the data packets Connor was manipulating. Initially, I believed he was simply executing a clumsy data heist. The dark web leak was a sloppy distraction to cover his tracks while he downloaded the most lucrative shipping contracts to a remote server. But as I monitored his keystrokes in real time, a much darker reality began to unfold. Connor was not just extracting information. He was actively injecting a massive block of foreign, highly malicious code directly into the root directory of the company routing software. I recognized the architectural signature of the code immediately. It was a sophisticated military-grade ransomware payload. Connor was planting a digital time bomb inside the primary logistics network. Once the payload fully executed, it would systematically encrypt every single routing algorithm, permanently locking Vanguard out of its own delivery infrastructure. The entire company fleet would be paralyzed nationwide. I analyzed the specific destination folders he was targeting. He was meticulously routing the origin of the ransomware deployment to my personal administrative credentials. Connor did not just want to steal the company assets and run. He intended to completely annihilate the corporate infrastructure and leave a digital trail of breadcrumbs pointing directly to me. He wanted the federal authorities to believe that a bitter ousted founder had launched a vindictive cyber attack out of pure spite. Patricia had already told the employees I was unhinged. She had already frozen my accounts under the pretense of embezzlement. Connor was carefully manufacturing the exact federal evidence needed to send me to a maximum security prison for the rest of my natural life. The sheer malice of his plan was breathtaking. My own family had handed him the shovel he was using to dig my grave. "Frederick, he is setting the detonation protocol," Maxwell warned, urgently pointing at the rapidly scrolling lines of malicious code on the screen. "You have administrative override. You need to sever his connection and isolate the infected servers right now before the ransomware permanently embeds itself into the system architecture. I rested my hands on the keyboard. I had the absolute power to terminate Connor's access with a single keystroke. I could protect the company I built. I could save the logistics network and prevent the impending supply chain collapse. But I hesitated. If I stopped him now, Connor would simply claim he was running a diagnostic test. Patricia would never believe me. Vanessa would blindly defend her husband. I would be a man shouting into the void with zero actionable evidence. I made a cold, heavily calculated decision. I pulled my hands away from the keyboard entirely. "We are not going to stop him," I said, my voice eerily calm in the quiet repair shop. "We are going to let him infect the entire system." Maxwell stared at me in profound shock. "If you let that payload execute, the company will lose millions of dollars in a matter of hours. The trucks will stop moving. The clients will sue Vanguard into total bankruptcy." "Exactly," I replied. "Connor is currently committing a massive federal crime. To secure an ironclad indictment for corporate sabotage and grand larceny, the crime must be fully executed. I will let him destroy Patricia's false empire to gather the undeniable forensic proof I need to bury him permanently." My phone suddenly vibrated on the wooden workbench. The caller identification displayed a private number. The consequences of my silence were about to arrive. I navigated my vintage truck through the narrow industrial corridors on the east side of the city until I reached a cracked asphalt alleyway. I parked behind a rusted corrugated metal door that belonged to Maxwell Electronics. Maxwell and me first met in 1982. We were two young African-American men trying to break into the emerging tech industry. When venture capitalists laughed us out of their pristine boardrooms, we pooled our meager savings and built our first servers from salvaged military surplus parts. Maxwell never cared for the corporate spotlight. He preferred the quiet hum of his chaotic repair shop surrounded by mountains of obsolete motherboards and tangled copper wiring. I walked through the heavy door. The distinct smell of burning solder and stale coffee hit me instantly. Maxwell looked up from a microscope, adjusting his thick glasses. I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I placed my $40 on his cluttered workbench. "Patricia threw me out of the company this morning," I stated firmly. "She aligned with Vanessa and my new son-in-law to execute a hostile takeover. They froze every single bank account I own, but that is not the immediate crisis. Connor is currently inside the Vanguard data logistics mainframe. He is dumping highly classified client manifests onto the open web to mask a massive data theft. I need an untraceable terminal. I need a rig completely disconnected from modern commercial networks, and I need it right now." Maxwell did not ask a single unnecessary question. He looked at the $40, pushed it aside, and stood up. He walked over to a metal storage cage in the back corner of his shop. "Let us build a ghost," Maxwell replied. We cleared a wide space on a heavy wooden workbench. For the next hour, we worked with absolute synchronized precision. We did not use store-bought commercial laptops or modern operating systems. We cannibalized vital parts from discarded commercial servers and wired them directly into a stripped-down motherboard. Maxwell soldered the physical connections while I manually coded a completely localized operating system on a separate solid-state drive. We needed a machine that possessed absolutely no digital fingerprint. I connected our makeshift terminal to a series of heavily encrypted proxy servers that Maxwell routed through an old satellite dish on his roof. Once the physical rig was entirely stable, I began the digital infiltration. Vanguard Data Logistics possessed the most formidable corporate firewall in the state because I was the man who built it from scratch. I knew exactly where the structural blind spots were located. I typed lines of complex code into the black terminal screen, weaving my way past the primary security gates. I bypassed the two-factor authentication protocols without triggering a single internal alarm. My pulse remained entirely steady. I was no longer a discarded husband or a betrayed father. I was a digital architect, walking straight through the invisible walls of my own fortress. Within 20 minutes, the terminal screen flashed green. I was officially inside. I had successfully secured a completely undetected backdoor into the central nervous system of my company. I opened the live administrative logs and mirrored the exact screen Connor was currently viewing from the executive suite. I watched the raw data stream rapidly across my monitor. Maxwell pulled up an old chair beside me, handing me a mug of bitter black coffee. "You are officially invisible," Maxwell stated quietly. Now let us see exactly what your son-in-law is trying to steal. I focused my complete attention on the data packets Connor was manipulating. Initially, I believed he was simply executing a clumsy data heist. The dark web leak I had been warned about seemed like a sloppy distraction to cover his tracks, while he downloaded the most lucrative shipping contracts to a remote server. But as I monitored his keystrokes in real time, a much darker reality began to clearly unfold. Connor was not just extracting information, he was actively injecting a massive block of foreign, highly malicious code directly into the root directory of the company routing software. I recognized the architectural signature of the code immediately. It was a sophisticated, military-grade ransomware payload. Connor was planting a digital time bomb inside the primary logistics network. Once the payload fully executed, it would systematically encrypt every single routing algorithm, permanently locking Vanguard out of its own delivery infrastructure. The entire company fleet would be paralyzed nationwide. I analyzed the specific destination folders he was targeting. He was meticulously routing the origin of the ransomware deployment to my personal administrative credentials. Connor did not just want to steal the company assets and run. He intended to completely annihilate the corporate infrastructure and leave a digital trail of breadcrumbs pointing directly back to me. He wanted the federal authorities to believe that a bitter, ousted founder had launched a vindictive cyber attack out of pure spite. Patricia had already told the employees I was unhinged. She had already frozen my accounts under the pretense of embezzlement. Connor was carefully manufacturing the exact federal evidence needed to send me to a maximum security prison for the rest of my natural life. The sheer malice of his plan was breathtaking. My own family had eagerly handed him the shovel he was using to dig my grave. "Frederick, he is setting the detonation protocol," Maxwell warned, urgently pointing at the rapidly scrolling lines of malicious code on the screen. "You still have administrative override. You need to sever his connection and isolate the infected servers right now before the ransomware permanently embeds itself into the system architecture." I rested my hands over the keyboard. I possess the absolute power to terminate Connor access with a single keystroke. I could protect the company I built. I could save the logistics network and prevent the impending supply chain collapse. But I hesitated. If I stopped him now, Connor would simply claim he was running a routine diagnostic test. Patricia would never believe my warnings. Vanessa would blindly defend her husband. I would remain a man shouting into the void with zero actionable evidence. I made a cold, heavily calculated decision. I pulled my hands entirely away from the keyboard. "We are not going to stop him," I said, my voice eerily calm in the quiet repair shop. "We are going to let him infect the entire system." Maxwell stared at me in profound shock. "If you let that payload execute, the company will lose millions of dollars in a matter of hours. The trucks will stop moving. The clients will sue Vanguard into total bankruptcy." "Exactly," I replied. "Connor is currently committing a massive federal crime. To secure an ironclad indictment for corporate sabotage and grand larceny, the crime must be fully executed. I will let him destroy Patricia False Empire to gather the undeniable forensic proof I need to bury him permanently. But digital logs will not be enough to satisfy a federal judge. I need the physical contracts from my home safe before Patricia finds them." I stood up, leaving the ghost terminal running, completely unaware of the trap waiting for me at my own front door. I drove away from the wailing sirens, leaving the house I had purchased with my first major corporate contract. The physical structure no longer mattered. I navigated the heavy morning traffic toward the financial district, pulling into the underground parking garage of a sleek glass tower. I rode the elevator to the 42nd floor. The polished doors opened into the sterile, hyper-modern office of Gregory Vance. Gregory was not a family friend or a casual confidant. He was a ruthless corporate litigator who specialized in dismantling hostile takeovers. I walked past his receptionist and entered his corner office. I dropped the printed copies of Patricia's emergency injunctions onto his glass desk. Gregory adjusted his silver tie and read through the legal filings with clinical precision. His expression hardened with every page. "Patricia is not playing a small game," Frederick Gregory stated coldly. "She retained Sterling and Croft. They are the most aggressive corporate litigation firm on the Eastern Seaboard. Furthermore, she authorized a $2 million retainer paid directly from the Vanguard Data Logistics operational accounts. My own wife was utilizing the exact financial reserves I had spent 40 years stockpiling to finance my absolute destruction. They secured a total asset freeze by categorizing you as an erratic threat to national supply chains. Connor fabricated a brilliant digital narrative painting himself as the whistleblowing savior. Gregory leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a heavy pen against his palm. If we attempt to fight this using conventional litigation, they will bleed you dry in civil court until you capitulate. They possess infinite company resources, and you are currently locked out of your own checking accounts. We cannot fight them conventionally, I replied smoothly. We are going to completely obliterate the battlefield. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the severely scratched hard drive I had extracted from my hidden floor safe just minutes before the police arrived. I set the small metal casing directly onto Gregory's immaculate glass desk. Gregory stared at the device, immediately recognizing the gravity of what I had brought. I established Vanguard Data Logistics in an era when no corporate entity believed a black engineer could securely route international freight, I explained evenly. I knew that if I ever succeeded, ruthless competitors would attempt to strip the intellectual property from my hands. I structured the company to look like a standard logistics firm on paper, but I never integrated the proprietary routing algorithms into the corporate charter. Gregory pulled a thick archived file from his locked cabinet and cross-referenced the original incorporation documents. A sharp, predatory smile crept across his face. The software patent is securely registered under a completely isolated blind trust, Gregory confirmed, dragging his finger across the yellowed parchment. You are the sole active trustee. Patricia holds 60% of the corporate shares. She legally commands the warehouses, the delivery contracts, and the physical fleet of 3,000 trucks. However, she does not own a single line of the code required to operate them. I nodded. Without my routing software, those 3,000 trucks are nothing but useless metal boxes sitting idly in parking lots. Connor believes he is hacking a comprehensive corporate network. He does not realize he is only accessing the superficial shell. The actual brain of the logistics empire belongs entirely to me. Patricia assumed she could take the throne by changing the locks on the building. We are going to legally prove that she merely stole an empty castle. Gregory immediately opened his secure laptop and began drafting the legal execution. We are going to deploy the poison pill, he announced, his fingers flying rapidly across the keyboard. Vanguard Data Logistics currently operates under an active licensing agreement with your blind trust. We will draft an immediate unilateral revocation of that software license. The moment I file this document with the Federal Copyright Office, Vanguard loses all legal authorization to use the routing algorithms. Any attempt by Connor or Patricia to run the network will constitute a massive federally prosecutable intellectual property theft. I watched the legal jargon fill the bright monitor. Patricia and Connor had confidently maneuvered me into a corner, assuming my silence was a sign of submission. They were unaware that this precise countermeasure had been waiting in the dark for decades. Once this revocation is processed, the company valuation will plummet to zero, I stated. The international clients will demand immediate answers when their supply chains halt. Patricia will face a catastrophic breach of contract crisis with absolutely no operational tools to resolve it. Exactly, Gregory confirmed, printing the heavy stack of legal documents. By the time their expensive lawyers realize the software is completely detached from the corporate entity, Vanguard will be drowning in operational debt. You will sign these papers today, and I will hold them in escrow until you give me the exact signal to drop the guillotine. I took the heavy fountain pen from Gregory's desk. I did not hesitate. I signed my name with sharp, deliberate strokes, officially sealing the financial doom of the woman who had betrayed me and the intern who thought he could steal my legacy. I placed the pen down, ready to finalize the strategy, when a loud knock shattered the quiet room. Gregory's heavy office door swung open. His senior secretary stood in the doorway, clutching a sealed legal envelope. She looked entirely breathless, bypassing all standard protocol. "Mr. Vance," she said urgently, placing the envelope directly in front of Gregory. "A private courier just served this to the front desk. It is marked for immediate executive review." Gregory sliced the envelope open and scanned the first 2 pages. His predatory smile vanished instantly, replaced by a tight, grim line. He handed the papers to me. "You have a massive new problem, Frederick," he warned. I looked at the bold black lettering on the legal summons. Global Freight Solutions. Our most lucrative international client had just filed a $70 million civil lawsuit. However, they were not suing Vanguard Data Logistics. They were suing me personally. I read through the aggressive allegations. Connor had not just initiated a data leak to cover his espionage. He had proactively contacted our largest clients early this morning. He expertly spun a narrative claiming that I had suffered a severe mental breakdown, stolen their highly classified shipment data, and dumped it on the dark web out of pure malice. He presented Patricia's emergency injunction as proof of my guilt. Connor had successfully weaponized the clients against me before I could even finalize my defense. If this lawsuit proceeded, the federal authorities would seize the blind trust assets to cover the $70 million damages. I placed the summons on the glass desk. Connor was moving much faster than a standard corporate spy. He was actively destroying my personal freedom. I cannot fight a phantom enemy from this office, I said, buttoning my coat. I have to look my daughter in the eye and stop this narrative at the source. I left Gregory's office and drove straight to the financial district's upscale cafe corridor. I did not need to guess where Vanessa would be. For the past 4 years, she spent her Tuesday mornings at a corner table inside an artisanal coffee shop on Market Street, holding court with other wealthy wives while their children attended expensive private preschools. I parked my truck and walked through the heavy glass doors. The air smelled of roasted espresso and overpriced pastries. I spotted her immediately. She sat near the window, sipping a latte and scrolling through her phone with a look of supreme boredom. I pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down without an invitation. Vanessa jolted, spilling a drop of her drink onto her designer silk blouse. The immediate shock on her face quickly hardened into a defensive, hostile glare. She looked around the crowded cafe to see if anyone was watching us. I did not give her the opportunity to launch into a rehearsed corporate speech. I reached inside my coat pocket, pulled out the printed server logs Maxwell and I had extracted from the ghost terminal, and placed them flat on the small wooden table. I slid the documents directly over her phone screen. I told her to look closely at the highlighted IP addresses. I explained that her husband was not conducting a financial audit to save Vanguard Data Logistics. I told her Connor was actively downloading the master client list to an external server and injecting a military-grade ransomware payload to destroy the primary network. I laid out the absolute proof of his felony wire fraud right in front of her eyes. I waited for the realization to hit her. I expected a reaction of shock or denial. I did not expect what came next. Vanessa did not even glance at the papers. She aggressively pushed the server logs back across the table, her manicured nails scraping against the wood. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. She told me to stop playing the victim. She recited Connor's lies verbatim, stating that I was an obsolete relic who refused to modernize. She claimed my outdated algorithms were holding the company back from a massive, highly profitable acquisition. She looked me right in the eye and said, Connor was the only one brave enough to forcefully drag the company into the 21st century. I sat perfectly still, observing the absolute conviction in her voice. She was not brainwashed. She was a willing participant in the theft. When I asked her how she could justify framing her own father for corporate espionage, she immediately weaponized the past. She accused me of being an absentee father. She complained that I spent her entire childhood locked in a hot garage, writing code while other fathers attended soccer games and school plays. She painted a picture of a neglected daughter who suffered while her father obsessed over circuit boards and software patents. I did not raise my voice, but I did not let her rewrite history. I reminded her of the exact reality we lived in. I told her the hours I spent bleeding over those circuit boards paid for the sprawling 5-bedroom house she grew up in. My code paid her tuition at Columbia University in full. My obsession funded the luxury lifestyle she currently enjoyed, including the very coffee she was drinking and the clothes on her back. I reminded her that while other fathers were playing soccer, I was fighting a deeply prejudiced corporate world that wanted to see a black tech founder fail. I built a fortress so she would never have to experience the financial terror I endured. Her complaints of neglect were nothing but a convenient manufactured excuse to justify her sheer greed. She wanted the kingdom, but she absolutely despised the king who built it. My logic only fueled her anger. Vanessa realized she could not win a factual debate against the undeniable evidence I had placed on the table. She resorted to the most ruthless weapon she possessed. She leaned across the table, her face inches from mine, and delivered a cold, calculated threat. She told me that if I filed a single legal motion against Connor or if I fought the $70 million lawsuit he had orchestrated with our biggest clients, I would never see my 5-year-old grandson or my infant granddaughter ever again. She explicitly stated she would file a restraining order and erase me completely from their lives. She demanded my total and unconditional surrender. She ordered me to sign over the blind trust containing the software patents, accept the public humiliation of the fabricated embezzlement charges, and fade quietly into obscurity so she and Connor could cash out the impending buyout. She held my legacy and my bloodline hostage, expecting me to break under the emotional weight of losing my family. She thought the threat of total isolation would force me to capitulate and hand over the keys to the empire I built. I looked at the woman sitting across from me. I searched her eyes for any trace of the little girl I had taught to ride a bicycle or the young woman I had proudly walked down the aisle. I found absolutely nothing. The greed had completely consumed her, hollowing out her morality and replacing it with a ruthless entitlement. She was fully prepared to send her father to a federal penitentiary just to secure her unearned payout. The pain in my chest was sharp, profound, and entirely final. I did not plead with her. I did not negotiate. I simply reached across the table and picked up the server logs. I folded the documents and placed them back inside my coat pocket. I looked at Vanessa with a cold, unwavering clarity. I told her that a family built on extortion is not a family worth keeping. I informed her that she had made her choice, and now she would have to survive the consequences of the war she helped start. I stood up from the table. I did not look back as I walked out of the coffee shop and into the bright city street. The last tether holding me back had just been severed. I had no wife to protect and no daughter to save. I was completely unburdened. I climbed into my truck, turned the ignition, and merged into the heavy traffic. Connor thought he had cornered a vulnerable old man. He did not realize he had just liberated a digital architect with nothing left to lose. I drove back toward the industrial district to initiate a deep trace on his digital footprint. I needed to know exactly who was buying the data Connor was stealing. I pulled my vintage truck into the cracked parking lot of the Starlight Motel on the very edge of the city limits. I paid the apathetic clerk using the remaining $40 I had borrowed from Maxwell. The room smelled of old smoke and cheap bleach. I did not care about the surroundings. I locked the heavy wooden door, pulled the blackout curtains shut, and set up the ghost terminal on the wobbly particle board desk. I connected the rig to the motel unsecured network and immediately routed my connection through the encrypted satellite proxies Maxwell had established. I accessed the back door I had left open inside the Vanguard Data Logistics mainframe. Connor was still active. He was moving massive blocks of encrypted client manifests through a series of dummy servers designed to bounce the signal across the globe and mask the final destination. He was using a standard tunneling protocol. It was a textbook maneuver taught in basic computer science classes. I bypassed his clumsy diversions by targeting the metadata embedded deep within the proprietary code I had personally written 40 years ago. I initiated a highly aggressive trace program. My screen flooded with cascading lines of raw numeric data as my code hunted down Connor digital footprints. I watched the packets jump from server to server, peeling back the layers of false IP addresses one by one. I forced the trace program to run at maximum capacity, pushing the makeshift hardware to its absolute limits. The cooling fan whined loudly in the silent motel room. I did not blink. I waited for the final IP address to resolve on my monitor. I needed to know exactly who was purchasing my life work. The numbers finally locked into place on the black screen. The final destination of the stolen data was not a black market server or an anonymous offshore bank. The coordinates resolved to a heavily fortified corporate mainframe located less than 50 miles away. The digital signature belonged to Apex Dynamics. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Apex Dynamics was a massive multinational logistics conglomerate. They were not just a competitor, they were an old, ruthless enemy. In the early 2000s, when Vanguard Data Logistics first secured a dominant market share, Apex Dynamics launched a brutal campaign to bankrupt me. They utilized illegal predatory pricing tactics to undercut my shipping routes. Their board of directors could not stomach the reality of a black-owned independent tech firm refusing their aggressive buyout offers. I fought them in federal court for 3 years and successfully drove them back. I built a digital fortress they could never penetrate from the outside. I stared at the glowing monitor in the dim motel room. Apex Dynamics had realized they could never defeat me in the open market or breach my firewalls externally. They needed someone to open the gates from the inside. Patricia believed she was securing a lucrative acquisition to modernize our company. Vanessa believed she was supporting her ambitious husband. They were both entirely blinded by their own greed. They did not understand that they were actively handing my entire empire over to the exact conglomerate that had tried to destroy our family 2 decades ago. Apex Dynamics was pulling the strings. Connor was not a brilliant prodigy executing a rogue data heist for personal glory. He was a Trojan horse. I tightened my grip on the edge of the desk. I needed to know exactly how deep the infiltration went. I did not stop at the perimeter of the Apex Dynamics server. I used the active data stream Connor had established to ride his signal directly back into their corporate network. I deployed a silent extraction algorithm sliding past their secondary firewalls before their security protocols could even register a breach. I navigated through their internal human resources database. I searched for any record matching my son-in-law. The screen populated with a highly classified contractor file. I opened the encrypted document. Connor was not an ambitious business school graduate looking for an internship. He was a senior corporate espionage asset directly employed by Apex Dynamics. His entire identity was a carefully constructed fabrication designed specifically to infiltrate Vanguard data logistics. I read through his operational directives. Apex had assigned him to target my daughter 2 years ago. He deliberately manipulated Vanessa, feeding her insecurities and amplifying her resentment toward my demanding work schedule. He married her solely to gain legal proximity to the executive suite. Once he secured Patricia absolute trust through flattery and false financial audits, he systematically engineered my expulsion. My wife and my daughter had thrown me out onto the street believing they were protecting the company from a senile, embezzling founder. In reality, they had handed the keys to the vault directly to a paid mercenary. Connor was receiving a flat fee of $5 million to deliver my routing software and client manifests to the Apex executives. The depth of the betrayal was staggering. Connor had weaponized my family arrogance perfectly. He played the role of the eager intern while methodically dismantling my life from the inside out. I downloaded his entire employment dossier, saving every single page of the explosive contract to my encrypted hard drive. I organized the stolen data packets, the server logs, and the classified Apex Dynamics employment contract into a single undeniable digital dossier. I possessed the absolute proof required to destroy them all. This was no longer a simple family dispute over corporate succession. It was no longer a civil matter regarding hostile takeovers or frozen bank accounts. Connor and the executives at Apex Dynamics were actively committing massive federal wire fraud, intellectual property theft, and corporate espionage. They were transferring highly sensitive trade secrets across state lines. The stakes had officially escalated to federal crimes carrying mandatory minimum prison sentences of 20 years. I detached the solid-state drive from the ghost terminal and placed it safely inside my jacket pocket. Patricia and Vanessa believed I was a broken old man crying in an empty room, devastated by my sudden irrelevance. They had no idea I was sitting in a cheap motel holding the exact evidence needed to trigger a relentless federal investigation. I had the power to burn their false reality to the ground. But submitting this evidence to the authorities right now would only alert Apex Dynamics. They would deploy their massive legal team to bury the evidence and shield Connor from prosecution. I needed to draw the Apex executives out into the open. I needed them to publicly commit to the fraudulent buyout while standing in the same room as my treacherous family. I stared at the blank screen of the terminal. I had to let Connor complete his digital sabotage. I had to watch him paralyze the supply chain I had spent 40 years building. The trap required extreme patience. My burner phone suddenly vibrated on the particle board desk. I kept my eyes locked on the ghost terminal Maxwell and I had built. The lines of code scrolling across the monitor suddenly stuttered. Connor had made a catastrophic error in his deployment sequence. The military-grade ransomware he had injected into the root directory was designed to execute at midnight, but his amateur coding triggered a premature compilation. The screen flashed violently before flooding with impenetrable red error codes. I watched in absolute silence as the central nervous system of Vanguard data logistics suffered a total cardiac arrest. The proprietary routing algorithm, the exact software I had spent years perfecting to optimize transcontinental freight, collapsed in real time. My secondary monitor displayed the live GPS tracking map of our entire national fleet. 3,000 delivery trucks were currently in transit across the country, carrying everything from medical supplies to automotive parts. Within 60 seconds, the moving green dots on my map turned solid gray and halted completely. The drivers were locked out of their navigation terminals. The warehouse distribution centers lost all access to the digital manifests. The loading bay doors would not open. The automated sorting machines ground to a heavy mechanical halt. The national supply chain was officially paralyzed. Connor had managed to detonate his digital time bomb, but he had blown himself up in the process. The sheer scale of the operational failure was staggering. Vanguard Data Logistics was bleeding hundreds of thousands of dollars with every passing minute the trucks remained stationary. I leaned back in the cheap motel chair, watching the destruction of my life work. I did not attempt to halt the malicious encryption. The crime was now fully executed. The digital trap had snapped shut exactly as I needed it to. The sharp ring of my burner phone shattered the heavy silence of the motel room. The caller identification displayed Patricia's personal cell phone number. I let it ring 3 times to establish control before pressing the answer button. Patricia did not offer a greeting. She launched into a hysterical, breathless tirade. "The entire network is completely dead," she screamed into the receiver, her voice shrill with genuine terror. "Every single computer in the executive suite is locked behind a black screen demanding an encryption key. The regional managers are calling me from 5 different time zones because the trucks are stranded on the highways. Fix this immediately, Frederick." I kept my breathing slow and measured. I asked her why she was calling a discarded, obsolete old man for technical support. Patricia ignored my question, driven by pure panic. "You did this," she shouted. "You planted a virus before you left the building, because you could not handle losing control. You are holding my company hostage out of pure spite. Give me the master override passwords right now, or I swear I will ruin you." Her desperation was palpable. The major clients were undoubtedly threatening her with massive breach of contract lawsuits. She needed a scapegoat, and she needed a savior. She expected me to crumble under her aggressive commands, just as I had compromised to keep the peace during the last decade of our marriage. She believed she still held the authority to dictate my actions. I listened to the frantic background noise on her end of the line. I could hear Connor shouting at the IT department, desperately trying to cover up his catastrophic error. The chaos inside the Vanguard headquarters was absolute. Patricia demanded the passwords a 3rd time, threatening me with total financial ruin. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I spoke with a quiet, lethal clarity that immediately silenced her screaming. "I do not work for Vanguard Data Logistics," I stated smoothly. "You stood in the lobby this morning and publicly declared that my methods were outdated. You proudly promoted a 26-year-old intern to vice president of operations because you claimed he possessed a vastly superior intellect. I highly suggest you instruct Connor to resolve the routing error." Patricia gasped, the reality of my refusal hitting her. "Frederick, this is not a game," she pleaded, her tone shifting from aggressive to desperate. "We are losing major international accounts by the minute. You built this network. You are the only one who knows the backdoor protocols. You have to save the family business." I reminded her that the family business died the moment she froze my bank accounts and conspired to send me to a federal prison. I informed her that I would never provide technical support to the thieves currently trying to rob me blind. "You chose your new executive team," I said coldly. "You can now reap the absolute destruction they have brought to your doorstep. I am not your employee, and I am certainly no longer your husband." Patricia realized the magnitude of my detachment. She tried to leverage Vanessa crying that the financial collapse would ruin our daughter's future. I cut her off immediately. I told her that Vanessa made her choice when she signed over my private retirement fund to a corporate spy. I stated that I felt absolutely no obligation to rescue the people actively digging my grave. I pressed the end call button, severing the connection entirely. I placed the burner phone face down on the desk. Patricia was a woman who attacked fiercely when cornered. She realized I would not supply the encryption keys to save her failing empire. She immediately pivoted to her most dangerous strategy. She needed a federal scapegoat to present to the furious clients and the board of directors. Within 10 minutes of our phone call ending, my ghost terminal intercepted a newly generated police dispatch report. Patricia had called the authorities. She officially reported me as a disgruntled former executive actively initiating a domestic cyber attack against critical national supply chain infrastructure. She provided the police with the exact GPS coordinates of my burner phone. She intended to have me violently arrested and my equipment confiscated before I could expose Connor's espionage. I rapidly detached the solid-state drive containing the complete forensic evidence of Connor's ransomware injection and his Apex Dynamics employment contract. I slid the encrypted drive safely into the interior pocket of my heavy coat. I executed a self-destruct command on the makeshift terminal Maxwell and I had built. The motherboard sparked and smoked completely, wiping the temporary operating system and destroying any digital link to the Vanguard network. I stood up and walked toward the motel room door. The flashing red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers began to reflect against the cheap blackout curtains. The wail of approaching sirens echoed loudly down the cracked asphalt alleyway. Heavy boots pounded against the concrete walkway outside my room. Patricia had weaponized the local police force to silence me permanently. She believed an aggressive raid would terrify me into submission. She did not know I had already secured the ironclad proof of her son-in-law's federal crimes. I unlatched the deadbolt and stood perfectly still in the center of the room, ready to face the ambush. I stood in the center of the motel room waiting for the inevitable. The heavy wooden door shuddered violently before giving way entirely to the sheer force of a police battering ram. 3 armed officers rushed into the cramped space, their tactical flashlights cutting sharply through the dim lighting. They shouted commands, ordering me to keep my hands visible and step away from the desk. I did not resist or argue. I raised my hands calmly and allowed them to secure the cuffs around my wrists. The lead officer immediately zeroed in on the wobbly particle board desk where my ghost terminal still sat, completely disabled and smoking faintly. He gestured for another officer to confiscate the hardware, carefully slipping the charred motherboard and my heavily encrypted laptop into clear evidence bags. They escorted me out of the room past the small crowd of motel guests who had gathered in the cracked asphalt alleyway. I walked with my head held high, ignoring the whispers and stares. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the night as they placed me into the back of a squad car. The ride to the precinct was silent. I focused my mind entirely on the upcoming confrontation. Patricia believed she had executed a flawless tactical strike by weaponizing local law enforcement against me. She expected me to arrive at the station frightened, confused, and desperate to bargain for leniency. She severely underestimated my absolute preparation. I was placed inside a sterile, brightly lit interrogation room consisting of a metal table and 2 bolted chairs. I sat completely still for 20 minutes before the heavy metal door finally opened. 2 detectives entered the room. The lead detective, a man named Harris, dropped a thick case file onto the table. Harris did not offer a greeting. He immediately launched into the aggressive narrative Patricia had carefully constructed. He stated that my wife, the majority shareholder of Vanguard Data Logistics, had officially reported me for initiating a massive coordinated cyber attack against the company's national supply chain network. He accused me of deliberately planting military-grade ransomware into the primary routing algorithms out of pure vindictive spite after being rightfully terminated for financial embezzlement. Harris leaned across the table, attempting to establish dominance. He questioned my character, painting me as a bitter, unstable old man who had lost his grip on reality and his company. I let him finish his entire speech without interrupting him once. When the room fell silent, I looked directly into his eyes and dismantled his entire premise. I informed him that I founded Vanguard Data Logistics in 1982. I detailed my flawless 40-year business record free of a single legal infraction or financial discrepancy. I then provided him with my active security clearance codes, reminding him that my routing software managed highly classified logistics contracts for several federal agencies. I stated clearly that a man with my operational history does not suddenly sabotage national infrastructure over a localized family dispute. Detective Harris frowned, his aggressive demeanor faltering slightly in the face of my absolute composure. He realized I was not the erratic suspect Patricia had described. I requested a whiteboard. The second detective hesitated, but eventually rolled a small portable board into the room. I stood up and drew a precise, detailed diagram of the Vanguard Data Logistics server architecture. I mapped out the primary firewalls, the secondary encryption protocols, and the physical location of the administrative terminals within the corporate headquarters. I then explained the exact nature of the ransomware currently paralyzing the company fleet. I proved using foundational logic and undeniable data structures that the specific malware payload could not have been injected remotely from an unsecured motel network without triggering a massive automated system lockdown. I demonstrated that the malicious code had to originate from a hardwired, highly privileged terminal located directly inside the executive suite. I reminded the detectives that I had been publicly fired, physically escorted from the building, and legally barred from accessing that specific suite over 12 hours before the attack commenced. The logic was completely airtight. I mathematically proved that the cyber attack was an inside job executed by someone currently sitting inside the Vanguard headquarters. The detectives stared at the whiteboard, realizing the full magnitude of the situation. Their primary suspect had just flawlessly exonerated himself. I returned to the metal table and sat down. I requested that they bring in my personal belongings. When the officer returned with my coat, I reached into the interior pocket and withdrew a small, heavily encrypted USB drive. I placed it squarely in the center of the table. I informed the detectives that the drive contained the complete undeniable IP logs, tracing the ransomware deployment directly to the administrative credentials of Connor, the new vice president of operations. I also stated that the drive contained absolute proof of Connor actively downloading the master client database and routing it to an offshore server. I officially filed a federal report against my son-in-law for grand larceny, corporate espionage, and the intentional sabotage of national supply chain infrastructure. Detective Harris picked up the drive, realizing his entire investigation had just flipped violently. The police removed my handcuffs immediately. I walked out of the precinct a completely free man, officially transitioning from Patricia's intended scapegoat into the key federal informant who would ensure Connor spent decades in a maximum security prison. I stepped out into the cool night air and hailed a taxi. I had successfully navigated the legal ambush, but my ultimate target remained elusive. I still needed to expose the true architect behind Connor's espionage. I needed to draw the executives from Apex Dynamics directly into the light. I stood on the bustling sidewalk outside the police precinct, watching the city lights blur into the dark sky. I had successfully dismantled Patricia's attempt to cage me in a jail cell, but my ultimate target remained safely hidden behind corporate lawyers and glass towers. I needed to expose the true architect behind the entire hostile takeover. I needed to draw the executives from Apex Dynamics directly into the light. I pulled my burner phone from my coat pocket and dialed a direct unlisted number I had extracted from their internal human resources database during my digital infiltration. A man named Pierce answered the line. Pierce was the senior vice president of acquisitions for Apex Dynamics. He was the corporate shark responsible for deploying Connor into my family. I did not sound like a formidable tech founder when I spoke to him. I purposefully softened my voice, letting a heavy exhaustion bleed into my words. I introduced myself and told him I knew exactly what he and Connor were doing to Vanguard Data Logistics. I told him Patricia had frozen my bank accounts and left me completely destitute. I played the role of a broken, defeated old man facing total financial ruin. I offered him a highly lucrative compromise. I promised to sign away my remaining founder rights and quietly walk away from the logistics empire without initiating a massive, protracted legal battle. In exchange, I demanded a quiet, under-the-table cash payout to fund my retirement. Pierce let out a low, arrogant chuckle. He agreed to meet me the following evening. We met at an absurdly expensive steakhouse located directly in the center of the financial district. I arrived early and requested a secluded leather booth near the back of the dimly lit dining room. I wore an older, slightly faded suit to perfectly sell the illusion of a man who had lost everything. Pierce arrived 15 minutes late, a deliberate power play designed to establish absolute dominance. He wore a bespoke Italian suit and possessed the slick, overly polished demeanor of a man who had never done a hard day of physical labor in his entire life. He slid into the booth opposite me, ordering a $200 glass of bourbon without even glancing at the menu. He did not offer a handshake or a greeting. He simply stared at me with pure, unadulterated condescension. "It is truly pathetic to watch you sitting here begging for scraps," Frederick Pierce sneered, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. "You older engineers never know when to gracefully exit the stage. You built a decent tracking system in the 80s, but you refused to accept that you had become entirely obsolete. Now your own wife and daughter have thrown you out onto the street." I swallowed my pride, gripping my hands tightly under the table. I forced my posture to slump. I stroked his massive ego exactly as I had planned. "You outsmarted me," I admitted quietly, keeping my gaze fixed on the white linen tablecloth. "Your infiltration strategy was flawless. I just want enough liquid capital to disappear quietly before Patricia completely ruins my reputation in the press." I will sign whatever non-disclosure agreements you require. Just pay me and I will never interfere with the acquisition." Pierce smiled, leaning back against the leather upholstery. He looked at me with the triumphant satisfaction of a predator cornering its prey. He was thoroughly enjoying the sight of the legendary founder surrendering his empire. Pierce took a slow sip of his expensive bourbon. His arrogance completely overrode his professional caution. He felt absolutely untouchable sitting in his territory, believing he held all the power over a desperate, broke old man. "You really have absolutely no idea how easy it was to tear your life apart," Pierce bragged, his voice dripping with malicious pride. "We tried to bankrupt Vanguard Data Logistics 20 years ago, but your firewalls were too annoying to crack from the outside. So we decided to simply buy a key to the front door. We recruited Connor straight out of our intelligence division. We instructed him to target your daughter. Vanessa was tragically easy to manipulate. Connor fed her deep-seated insecurities and amplified every single ounce of resentment she harbored against your demanding work schedule. He married her solely to gain legal proximity to your executive suite. Once he secured your wife's absolute trust through flattery and fabricated financial reports, he systematically engineered your total expulsion. We bought your entire family for a fraction of what a hostile corporate takeover would have cost us in civil court." I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer venomous cruelty of his words. Apex Dynamics had deliberately weaponized my daughter's emotional vulnerabilities to steal my software patents. They had orchestrated my family's collapse like a standard business transaction. My outward expression remained that of a defeated victim. However, my right hand rested casually on the table, the cuff of my jacket pulled back just enough to expose my vintage wristwatch. I was utilizing a high-grade military encrypted audio device hidden seamlessly inside the watch casing. I was recording every single syllable of his arrogant confession. I now possessed irrefutable, crystal-clear audio evidence of a senior corporate executive openly admitting to federal corporate espionage and targeted fraud. I kept my voice submissive and weak. "So the corporate espionage is complete," I murmured, staring at the empty glass in front of me. "Just give me my severance payout so I can leave the city. I will sign the buyout documents tonight." Pierce laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, and dropped the final, devastating bomb. "You are completely delusional," Frederick Pierce stated with chilling finality. "We are not paying you a single dime. You have absolutely zero leverage left to negotiate with us. Patricia already signed the binding acquisition documents this morning. She officially sold Vanguard Data Logistics to Apex Dynamics for $12 million. She surrendered all corporate authority and the money transfers into her holding accounts in exactly 2 weeks. We own your trucks. We own your shipping contracts. We own your entire legacy." Pierce stood up from the booth, tossing a $50 bill onto the table to cover his drink. He adjusted his expensive tie and looked down at me with absolute disdain. "Enjoy your retirement, Frederick," he said before turning and walking out of the restaurant. I sat alone in the quiet booth. The countdown had officially begun. Patricia had signed away the physical shell of the company. I had exactly 14 days before the massive federal wire transfer finalized the fraudulent sale. I reached down and stopped the recording on my watch. The time for gathering evidence was over. I paid the bill and walked out into the brisk night air. I needed to meet with my corporate attorney immediately. I had to activate the poison pill and legally sever my proprietary routing algorithms from the corporate entity before the buyout cleared. The 14-day ticking clock meant I had to completely destroy Patricia's false empire right now. I stood under the glow of a flickering street lamp and dialed Gregory. The cold night air stung my face, but my mind was entirely focused on the 14-day deadline ticking away in my head. I told my attorney that Apex Dynamics had already secured Patricia's signature on the buyout contracts. I explained that we could not afford to wait for a drawn-out civil litigation process. We had to execute our primary legal contingency plan immediately. Gregory did not hesitate for a single second. He instructed me to meet him at the federal courthouse at exactly 8 o'clock the following morning. I arrived 15 minutes early wearing a sharp charcoal suit. I walked up the wide marble steps of the courthouse feeling a profound sense of absolute clarity. Gregory met me near the security checkpoint holding a thick leather briefcase. His expression was dangerously calm. He pulled me aside into a quiet alcove and handed me a heavy stack of legal filings. The document on top was the formal activation of the poison pill clause embedded within my original blind trust. Gregory explained the exact mechanics of what we were about to do. For 40 years, Vanguard Data Logistics had operated under an exclusive ironclad licensing agreement with my private trust, allowing them to utilize my proprietary routing algorithms. The document I was holding would unilaterally revoke that license due to breach of contract and corporate espionage. The moment the judge countersigned the order, Patricia $12 million company would instantly be reduced to an entirely worthless collection of empty warehouses and idle metal trucks. I reviewed the paperwork with absolute precision. I was about to effectively annihilate my own corporate creation, but it was the only way to amputate the parasites feeding off my legacy. We walked into the private chambers of a federal judge Gregory had known for decades. The judge was a stern, meticulous man who had reviewed the emergency injunction request Gregory filed overnight. He scrutinized the original incorporation documents from 1982, cross-referencing them with the active blind trust ledger. Gregory presented the audio recording I had captured at the restaurant, firmly establishing the immediate threat of federal intellectual property theft by Apex Dynamics. The judge listened to the arrogant confession of the Apex executive with a hard, unyielding expression. He recognized the undeniable legal reality. Patricia owned the physical corporate shell, but I remained the absolute sole proprietor of the digital brain running the operation. Without a single word of hesitation, the judge picked up his pen and signed the revocation order. He stamped the document with the official federal seal. The extraction was legally complete. I thanked the judge, took my copy of the order, and stepped out of the chambers. With the stroke of a pen, Vanguard Data Logistics lost all legal authorization to access, copy, or operate my proprietary code. I pulled my encrypted mobile device from my pocket and typed in a complex sequence of administrative commands. I linked the federal revocation order to an automated kill switch I had embedded deep within the company network years ago. I initiated the extraction protocol. I watched the progress bar on my screen as my software systematically uncoupled itself from the Vanguard mainframes. Every algorithm, every routing code, and every automated tracking sequence dissolved from the corporate servers and retreated securely into my encrypted cloud vault. Patricia was now the proud owner of a dead empire. Miles away inside the executive suite of Vanguard Data Logistics, Connor was aggressively trying to finalize his treason. Based on the digital tripwires I had set, I could see his terminal actively pinging my secured vault. He was attempting to package the core routing software into a compressed file to deliver to his handlers at Apex Dynamics. He believed he had bypassed the initial ransomware failure and secured the ultimate prize. He was completely wrong. The moment he initiated the final download sequence, he slammed directly into the massive firewall generated by my kill switch. The system did not just deny his access, it actively retaliated. I watched the telemetry data on my phone as the defensive code executed its primary function. A cascading purge sequence swept through the local servers. Connor watched helplessly as the entire proprietary database deleted itself from the Vanguard network right in front of his eyes. Every folder he tried to open turned up entirely empty. The source code he had promised to deliver to Apex Dynamics vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but corrupted, useless text files in its wake. He had no backup. He had no secondary access point. The $5 million payout he was expecting from Apex was contingent on delivering a functional software package. He now possessed absolutely nothing to sell. He had destroyed his own operation. My phone registered the final server wipe. The Vanguard mainframes were completely sanitized of my intellectual property. The multi-million-dollar acquisition Patricia had bragged about was now officially dead on arrival. I knew exactly how Connor would react to the catastrophic collapse of his mission. Corporate spies operate on the assumption of their own superior intelligence. When they are outsmarted, panic immediately overrides their training. My encrypted phone intercepted a frantic ping from the Vanguard network trying to trace the origin of the kill switch command. I had deliberately left a digital breadcrumb attached to the federal revocation order leading directly back to the secure wireless network of the federal courthouse. I wanted him to know exactly who had beaten him. Connor realized his digital heist was completely ruined. He knew his handlers at Apex Dynamics would demand his head when they discovered he had lost the software. Driven by sheer desperation, he abandoned his computer. I received an alert from my network monitor that his mobile device was moving rapidly across the city. He was driving furiously toward the courthouse to intercept me. He intended to use physical intimidation to force me to surrender the decryption keys. Gregory walked beside me as we exited the heavy courthouse doors and stepped out into the bright morning sunlight. Gregory offered to have the courthouse security escort me to my vehicle, warning me that Connor was likely highly unstable. I declined his offer. I told Gregory that I had spent 40 years running from conflict to maintain the peace in my family. I was done running. I thanked Gregory for his legal execution and walked alone toward the sprawling parking lot. I spotted my vintage truck parked near the perimeter. Before I could even reach into my pocket for my keys, the screech of burning rubber shattered the quiet morning. A sleek black sports car swerved aggressively into my path, blocking my truck entirely. The driver's side door flew open. The time for digital warfare was over. I stepped off the polished courthouse steps and walked alone toward the sprawling visitor parking lot. The crisp morning air felt incredibly clean. I had successfully severed my lifework from the thieves who thought they could steal it. I spotted my vintage truck parked near the perimeter fencing. Before I could even reach into my pocket for my keys, the piercing screech of burning rubber shattered the quiet morning. A sleek black sports car swerved aggressively into my path, its tires smoking as it jumped the curb and blocked my truck entirely. The driver's side door flew violently open. Connor stepped out. The meticulously groomed, polite intern facade he had used to charm my wife and manipulate my daughter was completely gone. His expensive designer shirt was wrinkled and soaked with sweat at the collar. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and darting around the lot with sheer panic. He slammed his car door shut and marched directly toward me. He was breathing heavily, closing the physical distance between us with aggressive, predatory strides. He thought he could use his youth and physical size to intimidate a 70-year-old man who had just outsmarted him on a global scale. I did not step back. I stood my ground, leaning casually against the solid steel frame of my truck. I watched him approach, with the clinical detachment of a man examining a broken, malfunctioning machine. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had just snapped shut. The $5 million payout he was counting on had evaporated into the digital ether. He had failed his handlers at Apex Dynamics, and now he was completely desperate. "Give me the decryption keys right now," Connor demanded, his voice cracking with a frantic, breathless hysteria. "You think you are a genius, Frederick. You think you can just delete a $12 million acquisition and walk away. If you do not restore that routing software to the Vanguard servers immediately, I will personally ensure the federal authorities find terabytes of illegal, highly classified contraband planted directly on your personal home network. I will bury you so deep under federal charges you will never see daylight again." I did not flinch at his desperate threats. I looked at him and let a cold, razor-sharp smile form on my face. "You do not possess the architectural understanding required to plant a single file on my private network." "Connor," I replied smoothly, "you are a low-level corporate spy who relies on social engineering because you cannot write a functional line of original code." I detailed exactly how I had monitored his clumsy infiltration from a ghost terminal built from scrap parts. I explained how I watched him accidentally trigger the military-grade ransomware payload prematurely because he fundamentally misunderstood the root directory syntax of my proprietary software. I told him that I did not just delete the software from Vanguard. I weaponized the extraction protocol. The kill switch I deployed did not just wipe my algorithms. It actively traced his outgoing data packets directly back to the Apex Dynamics mainframe. "You thought you were executing a flawless digital heist?" I continued, my voice echoing clearly across the empty parking lot. "You were merely swimming in a shallow kiddie pool while I controlled the entire ocean. You left a digital trail of breadcrumbs so massive that a first-year cybersecurity student could follow it directly to your handlers. I already forwarded your classified Apex employment contract and the complete IP logs to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are not going to frame me for anything. You are going to spend the next 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary for interstate wire fraud and corporate espionage." I reminded him that true engineering requires building something from nothing, just as I did in my garage 40 years ago. He was nothing but a parasite feeding on the labor of actual creators. His entire career was a shallow fabrication. The absolute realization of his total failure shattered whatever fragile composure Connor had left. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He let out a guttural, furious scream and lunged forward. He threw a wild, heavy punch aimed directly at my jaw, putting his entire body weight behind the strike. He expected me to freeze in fear. He expected a frail old man to crumble under physical violence. He was entirely wrong. I spent decades working on heavy diesel engines and hauling server racks before I ever sat in a comfortable executive chair. I anticipated the swing the moment his shoulder dropped. I stepped smoothly to the left, pivoting my stance with practiced ease. Connor swung completely through the empty air. The sheer momentum of his missed punch carried him forward off balance. He stumbled violently and crashed headfirst into the solid steel side panel of my vintage truck. The heavy impact echoed loudly. He fell to the pavement, clutching his bleeding face and groaning in severe pain. I looked down at him sprawling on the concrete. He was a pathetic sight, a corporate mercenary reduced to a bruised and bleeding amateur in a matter of seconds. I calmly reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my encrypted mobile device. I angled the screen so Connor could clearly see the bright red recording icon flashing in the corner. I did not just record this encounter, I informed him, my voice completely devoid of pity. I have been live streaming a direct audio and video feed to my corporate attorney Gregory since the moment you swerved into this parking lot. He is currently submitting the footage of your unprovoked physical assault to the local police department as a supplemental charge to your federal indictment. Connor stared at the phone screen in absolute terror. The color completely drained from his face as he realized he had just handed me the final undeniable piece of criminal evidence. He scrambled awkwardly to his feet, leaving streaks of blood on the concrete. He backed away toward his sports car, his arrogance entirely replaced by sheer panic. "You think you won?" Frederick Connor spat, gripping the handle of his car door. "I'm going to destroy you in the court of public opinion. I will make sure the entire city believes you are a dangerous, senile lunatic." He threw himself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and sped out of the parking lot, running a red light in his desperation to escape. I stood alone in the quiet morning air, sliding my phone back into my pocket. I climbed into my truck and drove back to my secure motel room to prepare for his final desperate maneuver. Connor kept his promise. The very next morning, I turned on the small television in my room and watched a vicious, highly coordinated smear campaign hit the local news networks. The battle had officially spilled out into the public eye. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth at a local diner a few blocks away from the courthouse. A half-empty mug of black coffee sat on the formica table in front of me. Above the counter, a mounted television played the local morning news. The volume was low, but the bright graphics running across the bottom of the screen were impossible to miss. Patricia and Connor had not wasted a single minute after the disastrous parking lot encounter. They had launched a massive, highly funded public relations campaign designed to completely assassinate my character. The news anchor spoke with manufactured gravity, discussing the tragic downfall of a local tech pioneer. A polished photograph of me appeared on the screen, followed immediately by a carefully edited video clip of Patricia standing outside the corporate headquarters. She wore a solemn expression, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. She told the reporters that her husband was suffering from severe, aggressive cognitive decline. She claimed I had become dangerously paranoid, stealing millions of dollars in company assets to fund a delusional conspiracy theory. Connor stepped into the camera frame, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. He looked like the perfect, responsible son-in-law, assuring the public that the new executive team was working around the clock to stabilize the company and protect the employees from my erratic outbursts. They had hired a crisis management firm to distribute fabricated internal memos, painting me as a hostile, combative leader who refused to accept medical help. The narrative was expertly crafted. It was designed to completely invalidate any evidence I might bring forward. If a senile, bitter founder suddenly claims corporate espionage, the public and the shareholders simply roll their eyes and offer pity. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching them drag my 40-year legacy through the mud. I did not feel a single ounce of shame. Their aggressive media strategy was nothing but a smokescreen to hide the absolute panic consuming them behind closed doors. My encrypted phone began to vibrate relentlessly on the diner table. The smear campaign was highly effective. Within an hour of the broadcast, my inbox flooded with text messages and voicemails from former colleagues, industry peers, and rival tech founders. I opened a few of the messages. They were not filled with anger or accusations. They were filled with something far more insulting. They were dripping with pity. Men who had tried and failed to bankrupt me 2 decades ago were now offering their fake sympathies. Former board members asked if I needed them to recommend specialized neurological facilities. One message even came from a prominent venture capitalist suggesting I surrender my voting shares quietly to preserve the memory of the great man I used to be. The public noise was absolutely deafening. Patricia was successfully isolating me from the broader business community, creating a wall of social stigma that no respected executive would dare cross. I locked the screen of my phone and slid it back into my coat pocket. I ignored every single message. I did not care what the public believed. I did not care about my superficial reputation among wealthy investors who only valued profit margins. My entire focus shifted away from the media circus and narrowed with absolute precision onto the only people who actually mattered. I needed to secure the loyalty of my core engineering team. They were the architects who maintained the physical servers, managed the local hardware, and kept the digital infrastructure breathing. Without them, the company would completely die, allowing Apex Dynamics to simply swoop in, replace my staff with their own corporate contractors, and salvage the remaining physical assets. I could not let Patricia drive my people out before the final trap snapped shut. I knew the atmosphere inside the Vanguard headquarters was currently toxic beyond measure. Patricia was undoubtedly patrolling the bullpen, demanding absolute loyalty and forcing the remaining staff to sign aggressive non-disclosure agreements. Connor was frantically trying to assert authority over a technical department he fundamentally did not understand. My senior engineers were brilliant, fiercely independent men and women who despised corporate bureaucracy. I knew they would not tolerate being treated like disposable pawns by an incompetent intern. I accessed a secure encrypted messaging channel I had established for emergency protocols years ago. I sent a direct, untraceable ping to Brian, my lead systems architect. I instructed him to gather the foremost senior engineers and meet me at an abandoned textile warehouse on the industrial south side immediately after their shift ended. I arrived at the location an hour early to ensure we were not being followed. The warehouse was a cavernous, empty space illuminated only by the fading evening light filtering through broken skylights. At exactly 6:00, a single car pulled through the rusted chain-link fence. Brian stepped out, followed by the rest of my core technical team. They walked toward me with heavy, exhausted steps. They did not look happy to see me. Their faces were etched with deep frustration, confusion, and profound anger. Brian stopped a few feet away, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me, waiting for an explanation. The team had spent the last 5 weeks working under the tyrannical rule of my wife. They had watched me get escorted out of the building. They had seen the news reports claiming I was a delusional thief. They were preparing to submit their formal resignation letters the very next morning. "We are done, Frederick," Brian stated, his voice echoing sharply off the concrete walls. "We held the line for 5 weeks because we thought you had a plan. But you vanished. Patricia is tearing the department apart. Connor is running around demanding access to encrypted servers he cannot even comprehend. Half the staff believes you actually stole the operational funds, and the other half thinks you completely lost your mind. If we do not walk out tomorrow, they are going to fire us and ruin our careers." I listened to his anger, acknowledging the immense pressure they had endured. I told them that if they resigned tomorrow morning, they would be handing Vanguard data logistics directly to the enemy. I explained that Apex Dynamics was waiting in the shadows. The moment my senior engineers walked out the door, Apex would immediately deploy their own technical contractors to bridge the gap, bypass my security measures, and secure the remaining physical data centers. A mass resignation would give Connor the exact excuse he needed to finalize the corporate transition. The engineers stared at me, demanding the truth. I did not offer them emotional speeches or empty promises. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the physical evidence. I spread the printed server logs, the IP trace reports, and Connor's classified employment contract across a wooden shipping crate. I laid out the absolute proof of the corporate espionage, the ransomware injection, and the impending fraudulent buyout. I showed them exactly how my wife and my daughter had sold them out to a ruthless conglomerate. The anger in their eyes slowly transformed into profound realization. I told them I needed them to return to the hostile office for one final operation. I needed them to swallow their pride, pretend everything was normal, and prepare for a synchronized mutiny. I had to convince them to hold their ground inside the enemy camp until the trap completely closed. I did not offer them emotional speeches or empty promises. I reached into my battered leather briefcase and pulled out the physical evidence. I spread the printed server logs, the IP trace reports, and the raw hexadecimal data dumps across a rusted wooden shipping crate in the center of the warehouse. I told Brian and his team to look closely at the highlighted timestamps. I watched their eyes scan the complex lines of code that only seasoned network architects could fully comprehend. They recognized the administrative credentials immediately. I showed them exactly how Connor bypassed the secondary firewall using Vanessa's stolen proxy access. I pointed to the specific data packets containing our master client list being funneled directly to a masked offshore server. I made sure they saw the sheer amateurish execution of his code, proving he was relying on stolen credentials rather than actual engineering skill. Then I revealed the most devastating piece of evidence. I directed their attention to the root directory command logs. Brian physically recoiled when he saw the signature of the military-grade ransomware payload. I explained that Connor had not just stolen our most lucrative shipping manifests to cover his tracks. He had deliberately injected a catastrophic virus designed to permanently encrypt the primary logistics network and frame me for the entire collapse. The sheer anger in their eyes slowly transformed into a profound, chilling realization. They had spent the last 5 weeks working under the tyrannical rule of a 26-year-old intern who was actively planting a digital bomb right under their desks. They realized that Patricia was not modernizing the company. She was unknowingly accelerating its total destruction. The technical sabotage was only half of the betrayal. I needed them to understand the full scope of the corporate espionage. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my encrypted mobile device. I connected it to a small portable speaker I had brought with me. I told the 5 engineers to listen very carefully to the voice of the man who was actually pulling the strings. I pressed play on the audio file I had recorded at the steakhouse. The crisp, arrogant voice of Pierce, the senior vice president of acquisitions for Apex Dynamics, echoed loudly off the concrete walls of the abandoned textile warehouse. The engineers stood in absolute silence as they listened to Pierce brag about deploying Connor as a contracted corporate spy. They heard him detail how easily he had manipulated my family to orchestrate my hostile expulsion. But the true impact hit them when the recording shifted to the terms of the impending buyout. I let the audio run as Pierce explicitly outlined the post-acquisition strategy. Apex Dynamics had absolutely no intention of integrating our staff into their corporate structure or respecting the employment contracts I had put in place. Pierce stated clearly that the moment the $12 million wire transfer finalized, they would seize the proprietary software and immediately liquidate the entire Vanguard engineering department. They planned to fire every single technician, systems architect, and network manager without a dime of severance pay, replacing them entirely with cheaper outsourced Apex contractors. I stopped the recording. The silence in the warehouse was heavy and suffocating. The team had dedicated their lives to maintaining an impenetrable digital fortress, and Patricia had eagerly sold them out to a ruthless conglomerate that intended to throw them onto the street. Their previous frustration with my sudden absence completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, unified fury directed entirely at the people currently occupying the executive suite. They realized they were not just employees caught in a family dispute. They were collateral damage in a high-stakes corporate assassination. I looked at Brian. I told him that if they submitted their resignation letters tomorrow morning, they would be handing Apex Dynamics a clean, uncontested victory. Brian looked down at the server logs. His jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched in his cheek. He turned to face the 4 younger engineers standing behind him. He did not talk about stock options or corporate leverage. He reminded them of the financial crash in 2008. He recounted how the national banks had slashed our credit lines and major tech firms were laying off thousands of workers overnight. He looked directly at me and reminded the team that when our health insurance provider attempted to cancel our corporate policy, I had quietly liquidated my personal stock portfolio to pay everyone's medical premiums out of my own pocket for an entire year. I ensured that not a single employee missed a mortgage payment, a doctor's appointment, or a meal on their table, while the rest of the tech industry burned to the ground. Loyalty in this business is exceptionally rare, Brian stated firmly, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. Frederick protected our families when he did not have to. We are not going to let a spoiled intern and a greedy conglomerate tear down his house. The 4 engineers nodded in complete unison. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming an unbreakable perimeter. They agreed to follow my exact command. I laid out the final phase of our counteroffensive. I instructed them to return to the Vanguard headquarters tomorrow morning and act as if nothing had changed. I told them to swallow their pride smile at Patricia and follow Connor's incompetent orders without a single word of protest. They needed to maintain the illusion of a defeated, demoralized technical staff to keep the executives completely off guard. I handed Brian a secondary encrypted flash drive containing a highly specialized partitioning algorithm. I explained that on the exact morning the Apex Dynamics executives arrived to finalize the buyout, my team would deploy this code to silently lock down all secondary servers and block any external data migration. They would create an invisible digital cage right under Connor's nose, ensuring that not a single byte of useful data could be extracted when Apex demanded their prize. Brian took the drive, sliding it securely into his jacket pocket with a sharp nod of understanding. We shook hands in the dim light of the warehouse, sealing a pact that no corporate contract could ever break. I watched my team return to their vehicles and drive out into the night, officially transformed from fleeing employees into a deeply embedded sleeper cell. 5 agonizing weeks had now passed since I was escorted out of my own glass lobby. I had endured the smear campaigns, the frozen bank accounts, and the heartbreaking betrayal of my own daughter. Every piece of the board was now perfectly aligned. The trap was meticulously set, and the countdown had finally reached 0. I climbed into my vintage truck and started the heavy diesel engine. Tomorrow morning, Patricia was expecting a broken, defeated man to walk into her boardroom and sign away his final dignity. She was about to face a completely different reality. Exactly 5 weeks had passed since the morning I was violently escorted out of my own company. The sun had barely risen over the city skyline when my phone chimed on the small particle board desk of my motel room. It was a formal, coldly worded email sent directly from Patricia's executive assistant. The message did not ask for my presence. It commanded me to appear in the Vanguard Data Logistics boardroom at exactly 9 o'clock. Patricia intended to force my absolute surrender a full hour before the Apex Dynamics executives were scheduled to arrive and finalize the buyout. She wanted to neatly package my 51% founder shares and present them to her new corporate masters on a silver platter. I closed the email and stood up. I had spent the last 35 days living in a cheap room smelling of bleach, orchestrating a digital counteroffensive that my adversaries could not even comprehend. My core engineering team was already inside the building, sitting quietly at their desks, waiting for the precise moment to lock down the secondary servers. Gregory was standing by at the federal courthouse with the software revocation orders fully executed. Every single piece of my meticulously designed trap was armed and ready to snap shut. I did not feel a single ounce of anxiety or hesitation. I felt the profound, chilling calm of a man walking into a burning building completely immune to the flames. I packed my encrypted hard drives into my black leather briefcase. I prepared to face the family that had betrayed me. I did not wear the casual denim jacket or the comfortable work boots I usually favored for long days in the server room. I dressed in a meticulously tailored sharp charcoal suit. I drove my vintage truck to the industrial park and parked directly in the reserved executive space near the front entrance. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the lobby. The 2 security guards who had bruised my arms 5 weeks ago stood by the reception desk. They stepped forward instinctively, but they froze the moment they looked into my eyes. I did not break my stride. I walked right past them with absolute, undeniable authority. I pushed through the double doors leading into the main operational bullpen. A heavy, suffocating silence instantly fell over the entire floor. 50 employees stopped typing. Telephones went unanswered. They stared at me as I walked down the central aisle. Patricia and Connor had spent weeks spreading malicious rumors, painting me as a delusional, broken old man who had lost his grip on reality. But the man walking through their workspace did not look confused or defeated. I walked with the precise, measured steps of a digital architect who still owned every single wire and processor in the building. The senior engineers made brief, subtle eye contact with me as I passed their cubicles. Brian gave a slow, imperceptible nod. The mutiny was primed. I reached the heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom. I did not knock. I gripped the brass handles and pushed the doors wide open. I stepped into the expansive room. Patricia sat squarely at the head of the long mahogany table. She wore a victorious, arrogant smile that did not reach her cold eyes. Vanessa sat to her left, glaring at me with absolute, unwavering contempt. Connor occupied the chair to her right. He sat in my old seat wearing a brand new luxury watch purchased with stolen funds. He leaned back, radiating the unearned confidence of a corporate spy who believed he had successfully pulled off the heist of the century. I walked the length of the room and took my seat at the far opposite end of the table. I placed my black leather briefcase gently onto the polished wood. Patricia did not waste any time. She leaned forward, clasping her hands together. "I hope you spent the last 5 weeks sitting in whatever miserable hole you found, reflecting on your mistakes." Patricia began, her voice loud enough for the executives waiting outside the glass walls to hear. She pointed to a framed newspaper article hanging on the wall, detailing our first major logistics contract. She claimed she was the true visionary behind that success, arguing that I was merely a stubborn technician holding the company back from a highly profitable future. She slid a thin, pathetic legal document across the length of the table. It was a meager pension agreement. She informed me that if I signed away my remaining founder shares immediately, she would generously drop the fabricated embezzlement charges and allow me to fade quietly into obscurity. Vanessa chimed in, crossing her arms tightly. "You should be thanking Connor," Vanessa snapped, defending the thief sitting beside her. "He saved this company from your incompetence, and he secured a $12 million buyout. Just sign the papers, Dad, and walk away before you embarrass yourself any further." Connor offered a smug, patronizing chuckle, sliding a silver pen across the mahogany table toward my hands. Before the silver pen could even stop rolling across the polished wood, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom burst open again. A team of 5 men marched into the room with aggressive, calculated strides. The lead executive from Apex Dynamics entered first, flanked by a squad of high-priced corporate lawyers carrying thick leather portfolios. They did not wait for introductions. They brought the arrogant, predatory energy of a massive conglomerate ready to swallow an independent firm whole. The lead executive ignored Patricia entirely and locked his eyes directly onto me. He dropped the final binding acquisition contracts onto the center of the table. The paperwork required my explicit signature to legally transfer the contents of the blind trust. He demanded that I surrender my proprietary algorithms immediately so they could authorize the $12 million wire transfer to Connor's offshore shell account. The air in the room grew incredibly thin. Patricia, Vanessa, and Connor stared at me, their breath hitched in absolute anticipation. They believed this was the moment I would finally break. The tension in the boardroom reached its absolute peak, waiting for my complete surrender. The lead executive from Apex Dynamics tapped his gold pen against the buyout contract, waiting for my signature to finalize the $12 million acquisition. Connor leaned forward in his chair, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of his unearned $5 million espionage payout. Patricia tapped her manicured fingers on the mahogany table, looking at me with a mixture of impatience and absolute triumph. She honestly believed the sheer pressure of the corporate heavyweights standing in the room would force me to silently capitulate and surrender my life work. I did not reach for their documents. I did not touch the silver pen Connor had so arrogantly slid across the table. Instead, I calmly reached into my black leather briefcase. I withdrew a thick, sealed manila folder. I placed it squarely on the polished wood and slid it directly down the length of the long table toward my wife. Patricia caught the folder with a sharp, victorious smile. She assumed I had brought my own copies of the founder surrender forms, fully capitulating to her hostile takeover. She opened the flap and pulled out the legal documents. Her triumphant smile vanished the exact second her eyes processed the bold black lettering at the top of the very first page. It was not a corporate surrender. It was a legally binding decree of divorce, completely terminating our 38-year marriage, accompanied by my official letter of resignation from Vanguard Data Logistics. The color drained entirely from her face as she read the stipulations. I was not asking for a single dime of alimony or a single piece of the physical property. I was walking away from her completely unburdened and entirely free. "What on earth is this, Frederick?" Patricia demanded, her voice trembling as the sheer reality of the documents broke through her arrogant facade. I kept my posture perfectly straight, locking my eyes directly onto hers. I told her that I had spent 40 years bleeding into circuit boards and servers to build an impenetrable empire to protect my family. I reminded her that I shielded her from every financial hardship, ensuring she and Vanessa lived a life of absolute luxury and security. But instead of gratitude, I found myself surrounded by people who viewed me as nothing more than a disposable asset, an obsolete machine to be scrapped the moment a younger, cheaper alternative presented itself. I stated clearly that a family willing to manufacture federal embezzlement charges and weaponize the police against a 70-year-old man out of pure greed is not a family I care to claim. I am officially detaching my life from yours, I announced, my voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute finality. I am leaving you with the empty castle you fought so viciously to steal. Patricia slammed her hands onto the table, her composure shattering completely in front of the Apex executives. She screamed that I was a bitter, vindictive old fool attempting a pathetic stunt to ruin her crowning achievement. She shrieked that my resignation meant absolutely nothing because they were finalizing the $12 million buyout regardless of my dramatic exit. Vanessa stood up, joining her mother's hysterical outburst, demanding that I leave the boardroom immediately so they could sign the contracts and take their money. I did not raise my voice to match their chaotic screaming. I simply turned my attention away from them entirely. I ignored my furious wife and my treacherous daughter. I shifted my gaze to the lead executive from Apex Dynamics and the team of high-priced corporate lawyers standing behind him. I reached back into my briefcase and withdrew a second, much thinner folder. I slid this one directly across the mahogany table toward the Apex legal team. The lead attorney opened it cautiously, his professional demeanor tightening. I informed the Apex executives that they were about to authorize a $12 million wire transfer for a corporate shell that was entirely worthless. I explained that Vanguard Data Logistics did not own the proprietary routing algorithms that made the company valuable. I detailed the existence of the independent blind trust I established decades ago, explicitly separating the software patents from the physical corporation. Connor gasped, his face turning an ashen shade of pale as the realization hit him. He tried to interrupt, stammering that the software was safely housed on the local servers. I looked directly at him and stated that his amateur ransomware payload and his clumsy data extraction attempts were completely useless. I informed the boardroom that 14 days ago I stood before a federal judge and successfully activated a poison pill clause. I unilaterally revoked the software license from Vanguard Data Logistics. I told them that the digital infrastructure they believed they were purchasing had already been legally extracted and entirely deleted from the local network by an automated kill switch. Vanguard Data Logistics was now nothing but a collection of empty warehouses and idle metal trucks. Any attempt by Apex Dynamics to rebuild or access the routing code would constitute a massive federally prosecutable intellectual property theft. The lead Apex attorney pulled the federal injunction from the folder, verifying the judge's signature and the official government seal. He whispered urgently into the ear of the lead executive. The entire Apex delegation froze, realizing they had been completely outmaneuvered. I was not finished dismantling their operation. I pulled my encrypted mobile device from my coat pocket and placed it squarely in the center of the boardroom table. I tapped the screen, maximizing the volume on the internal speaker. I pressed play. The crisp, unmistakable voice of Pierce, their senior vice president of acquisitions, echoed loudly off the glass walls. The audio recording from the steakhouse played in its entirety. Everyone in the room listened in absolute silence as Pierce arrogantly bragged about deploying Connor as a contracted corporate spy. They heard him detail the exact strategy used to manipulate Vanessa, infiltrate the executive suite, and orchestrate my hostile expulsion to facilitate the buyout. I watched the faces of the Apex executives contort in sheer terror. They realized they were not just caught in a bad business deal. They were caught on tape openly admitting to federal corporate espionage, interstate wire fraud, and grand larceny. Patricia stared at Connor in absolute horror, finally understanding that her brilliant intern was a paid mercenary who had played her for an absolute fool. Vanessa collapsed back into her chair, covering her mouth as the reality of her husband's profound betrayal shattered her world. The boardroom erupted into total uncontrollable panic as the Apex legal team desperately scrambled to pack their briefcases and flee the building before the authorities arrived. The crisp audio of Pierce bragging about corporate espionage hung in the stagnant air of the boardroom long after the recording finished playing. The lead executive from Apex Dynamics stood absolutely frozen, his eyes darting from my encrypted phone to the pale faces of his legal team. The aggressive, predatory posture he had carried into the room vanished completely, replaced by the sheer visceral terror of a man staring down a 20-year federal prison sentence. He knew instantly that continuing with the acquisition would legally bind his entire multinational conglomerate to a massive intellectual property theft conspiracy. He reached down and snatched the pristine acquisition contract from the center of the mahogany table. He did not ask questions or attempt to negotiate a settlement. He gripped the heavy parchment and ripped the document cleanly in half, letting the torn pages flutter to the floor. "We have absolutely no business here," the executive barked at his lawyers, his voice cracking with undeniable panic. "We are withdrawing all offers immediately." The high-priced corporate attorneys did not need further instruction. They frantically shoved their legal pads and electronic tablets into their leather briefcases, desperate to evacuate the building before local law enforcement or federal agents arrived to seal the perimeter. They scrambled over each other, completely abandoning their polished professionalism. Patricia tried to block their path, her hands raised in a futile attempt to keep the $12 million deal alive. She pleaded with them to stay, insisting she could hire new engineers to fix the software issue. The lead executive shoved past her without a single word of apology, treating her like a toxic contagion. The entire Apex Dynamics delegation rushed through the heavy oak doors, leaving the ruins of the corporate takeover scattered across the boardroom floor. Connor watched his $5 million payout walking out the door. The smug, arrogant intern facade he had worn for the past 2 years completely disintegrated. He sprinted after the retreating executives, grabbing the lead attorney by the shoulder just as he reached the hallway. "Wait!" Connor shouted, his voice shrill with raw desperation. "I did exactly what Pierce hired me to do. I secured the inside access. You owe me my operational fee." The attorney violently swatted Connor's hand away, looking at him with absolute disgust. "You are completely radioactive," the attorney spat, not slowing his rapid pace toward the elevators. "You failed to deliver the proprietary code, and you allowed a 70-year-old engineer to record our senior vice president confessing to a federal crime. If you ever contact Apex Dynamics again, our legal department will bury you so deep you will forget your own name." The elevator doors slid shut, severing Connor's last tether to his corporate handlers. He stumbled backward into the boardroom, his breath coming in short, erratic gasps. He turned his frantic gaze toward Patricia. The polite deference he had used to manipulate her completely vanished. He pointed a shaking finger directly at her face. "This is entirely your fault," Connor screamed, his face contorting with blinding rage. "You were supposed to secure his signature weeks ago. I played the dutiful son-in-law, I audited your ridiculous spreadsheets, and I handed you the keys to the kingdom. You were just too slow and too incompetent to close the deal before the old man realized what we were doing. You ruined everything." Patricia stepped back, completely stunned, as the young man she had elevated to vice president of operations openly degraded her in front of her entire family. Vanessa stood frozen near the edge of the mahogany table, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. She had spent the last 2 years vehemently defending Connor against my warnings, believing she had found a brilliant, ambitious partner. Now she was looking at a ruthless corporate mercenary who had viewed her solely as a tactical entry point. She stepped forward, placing herself directly between Connor and her mother. "You married me just to get clearance to his executive suite?" Vanessa asked, her voice shaking violently with the devastating weight of the truth. "Our entire relationship was a calculated assignment from Apex Dynamics." Connor let out a harsh, cruel laugh entirely devoid of any affection. "Did you honestly believe a man my age wanted to spend his life listening to you complain about your wealthy childhood?" Connor mocked, looking at her with pure, unadulterated disdain. "You were the easiest mark I ever targeted. You practically handed me the administrative passwords the moment I stroked your ego." Vanessa raised her hand to strike him, but her profound shock paralyzed her. Connor did not stop twisting the knife. He knew he was going to face a federal indictment, and he intended to burn everything down on his way out. "You should check your personal investment accounts, Vanessa." Connor sneered, backing away toward the boardroom exit. "When I realized Frederick had deployed the kill switch on the software, I knew the Apex payout was permanently dead. I needed a massive escape fund to leave the country. I used the joint financial proxy you so willingly signed to completely drain your private savings this morning. Every single dollar you inherited is gone." Vanessa collapsed against the heavy wooden table, letting out a gut-wrenching sob as her marriage and her financial security shattered simultaneously. Patricia ignored her weeping daughter and stared blankly at the torn acquisition contract resting on the carpet. The true catastrophic scale of her financial reality was finally crashing down upon her shoulders. In her absolute certainty that the $12 million Apex buyout would clear by the end of the day, she had made a series of reckless, irreversible financial decisions. To fund the aggressive media smear campaign against me and cover the exorbitant retainer fees for her high-powered corporate lawyers, she had completely drained the Vanguard Data Logistics operational cash reserves. She had even taken out massive high-interest bridge loans using the physical truck fleet as collateral. She had bet the entire existence of the company on a check that was never going to arrive. Without my routing software to process the pending deliveries, the company would default on its international shipping contracts within 48 hours. The financial penalties alone would instantly push Vanguard into severe, inescapable bankruptcy. Patricia slowly turned her gaze toward me. I was still sitting at the far end of the boardroom table, my empty briefcase resting beside me. The arrogant, victorious executive who had summoned me to surrender was completely gone. Her expensive designer suit suddenly looked like a cheap, ill-fitting costume. She took a slow, trembling step toward my chair, her hands shaking visibly. "Frederick, you have to undo the revocation," Patricia pleaded, her voice cracking into a desperate, pathetic whisper. "If you do not restore the software to our servers right now, the bank will seize the trucks and we will lose the house. I will lose absolutely everything. Please, just type in the code and bring the system back online." I looked at the woman who had publicly branded me a thief and attempted to lock me in a federal prison. Patricia's desperate pleas for me to restore the routing software hung in the stagnant air of the executive boardroom. I did not even have the opportunity to answer her pathetic request. Before I could utter a single syllable, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the room swung open with such violent force that they slammed against the glass walls. A highly coordinated team of federal agents marched into the room. They wore dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across their backs. This was not a local police wellness check or a minor corporate inquiry. This was the catastrophic result of the encrypted solid-state drive I had personally handed to the lead detectives during my interrogation just days prior. I had provided the federal authorities with absolute, undeniable proof of a massive, multi-million-dollar interstate wire fraud conspiracy. The agents moved with terrifying, practiced precision. They immediately fanned out, physically securing every single exit and entirely blocking the glass walls of the boardroom to prevent anyone from escaping into the operational bullpen. The lead federal agent, a tall, imposing man with a severe, unyielding expression, walked directly to the head of the mahogany table. He did not ask for permission to speak. He loudly announced that Vanguard Data Logistics was now officially designated as an active federal crime scene. Patricia gasped, stumbling backward until her back hit the leather chair. She looked at the armed agents in sheer, unadulterated shock. She had spent the last 5 weeks operating under the delusion that she was a brilliant, untouchable corporate mastermind. She was finally waking up to the devastating reality that her hostile takeover had triggered a massive federal fraud investigation, and the absolute full weight of the United States government had just walked through her front door. 2 federal agents immediately bypassed Patricia and flanked Connor, the arrogant, condescending corporate spy who had just finished viciously mocking my daughter. Suddenly looked like a terrified, trapped child. An agent firmly grabbed Connor by the shoulder and forced him away from the mahogany table. They did not ask for his cooperation. Another agent swiftly disconnected Connor's sleek silver laptop, pulling the power cord directly from the wall. They dropped the computer into a heavy static-proof evidence bag. They systematically patted Connor down, extracting his personal mobile phone and the encrypted secondary device he used to communicate with his handlers at Apex Dynamics. Connor raised his hands in a frantic, desperate attempt to stop them. He stammered wildly, claiming he was just an innocent intern executing a standard financial audit under the direct orders of the chief executive officer. The lead agent ignored his pathetic excuses entirely. He pulled a thick, tightly bound legal document from his jacket pocket and held it directly in front of Connor's face. The agent read the federal arrest warrant aloud. He officially charged Connor with multiple counts of severe corporate espionage, grand larceny, and the intentional sabotage of critical national supply chain infrastructure. The agent specifically cited the illegal injection of military-grade ransomware into a secured federal logistics network. Connor's knees visibly buckled as the sheer magnitude of the charges crashed down upon him. He knew these were not civil infractions he could simply negotiate away. These were severe federal felonies carrying mandatory minimum sentences of 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary. The agents pulled Connor's arms roughly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed loudly throughout the silent boardroom. Connor began to hyperventilate, his entire body trembling violently. the polished, manipulative predator who had successfully infiltrated my family and attempted to steal a lifetime of my hard work, was completely gone. He was reduced to a weeping, hyperventilating criminal begging the federal agents to offer him a plea deal in exchange for testifying against his former employers. The agents did not entertain his cowardly negotiations. They gripped his arms and marched him firmly toward the exit. They dragged him past the exact same glass walls where he had smugly paraded his unearned authority for the past 5 weeks. The employees in the bullpen stood silently at their desks watching the false visionary being hauled away in disgrace. With Connor physically secured and removed from the immediate area, the lead agent turned his cold, uncompromising attention directly to my wife. Patricia raised her trembling hands, her eyes wide with frantic desperation. She immediately attempted to distance herself from the wreckage, frantically insisting that she had absolutely no knowledge of the ransomware or the corporate espionage. She cried that she was merely a victim of a manipulative con artist who had lied to her about the financial audits. The federal agent did not offer her a single ounce of sympathy. He reached into his coat and produced a second formal document. He informed Patricia that ignorance of the law does not provide legal immunity, especially for the active majority shareholder of a major logistics corporation. He stated clearly that by signing the executive proxy documents and officially authorizing a completely unvetted intern to access highly classified encrypted servers, she had committed a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty. The agent handed her a thick federal summons. He officially notified her that the government was charging her with gross corporate negligence and the reckless endangerment of secure commercial data. He explained that she was personally liable for the massive data breach that had compromised dozens of international supply chains. Her signature was on every single transfer authorization Connor had utilized to steal the proprietary manifests. Patricia stared at the harsh black text on the federal summons. The designer suit she wore suddenly looked completely absurd. She had spent her entire adult life insulated from consequences, shielded entirely by the unyielding fortress of my financial success. Now the fortress was completely gone, and she was left entirely exposed to the brutal, unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. Vanessa stood frozen against the far wall of the boardroom. She watched the federal agents forcefully drag her handcuffed husband into the crowded hallway. Her entire reality, her marriage, her stolen savings, and her unearned elite status had evaporated in a matter of minutes. Patricia finally collapsed. Her legs gave out completely, and she fell to her knees on the expensive carpet, clutching the federal summons to her chest as she sobbed uncontrollably into her hands. They were entirely broken, consumed by the absolute destruction their own boundless greed had engineered. I looked at the three of them one final time. I felt no anger and absolutely no pity. I reached across the long mahogany table and picked up my empty black leather briefcase. I adjusted my tailored charcoal suit and stood up. The federal agents did not block my path. They did not ask me a single question. I was the recognized informant who had delivered the criminal enterprise directly to their doorstep. I walked past the weeping remnants of my former family, entirely untouched by the law, and stepped out of the boardroom to reclaim my freedom. I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of the Vanguard Data Logistics headquarters and breathed in the sharp afternoon air. The adrenaline that had carried me through the boardroom execution was fading, replaced by a profound, solidifying peace. The industrial park was quiet, a stark contrast to the absolute devastation unfolding inside the executive suite. I walked across the sprawling concrete parking lot toward my vintage truck. I did not rush. My stride was even and measured. I had spent 40 years building the empire I had just legally dismantled, and yet walking away from the physical building felt remarkably effortless. I reached the driver's side of my truck and unlocked the heavy steel door. Before I could pull the handle, the sharp, frantic clacking of high heels echoed across the pavement behind me. I turned slowly. Patricia was sprinting across the parking lot. She had completely abandoned the poised, untouchable persona she had worn for the past 5 weeks. Her expensive designer suit jacket was unbuttoned and slipping off her shoulder. Her meticulously styled hair was disheveled from the physical shock of collapsing onto the boardroom floor. The federal agents had allowed her to leave the immediate crime scene, but they could not protect her from the catastrophic financial reality waiting for her. She practically stumbled as she closed the final few feet between us, gasping for breath. The woman who had stood in the lobby and proudly commanded security guards to throw me onto the street was entirely gone. In her place stood a terrified, ruined executive staring into the abyss of federal bankruptcy and personal destruction. She reached out her trembling hands, hovering just inches from my coat, terrified to actually touch me. "Frederick, please, you have to stop this," Patricia gasped, her voice cracking into a raw, pathetic sob. Genuine tears streamed down her cheeks, ruining her makeup and staining her collar. "You cannot just leave me here with nothing. The federal agents are confiscating everything in the building. The bank is going to freeze the corporate accounts by the end of the day, and they are going to take the house. You have to call your lawyer and restore the routing software. We can fix the contracts. We can make the deliveries. I will give you back your title, your shares, everything. Just type in the code and save us." And I stood perfectly still, resting my hand on the cool metal frame of my truck door. I watched her weaponize her tears, falling back on a survival instinct she had not needed to use in decades. When the reality of her gross negligence failed to move me, she immediately shifted her tactics toward deep emotional manipulation. She reminded me of 1982. She brought up the freezing winter nights we spent in our first cramped apartment eating cheap noodles while I soldered circuit boards on the kitchen table. She cried about how she had stood by me when the venture capitalists mocked my skin color and dismissed my vision. She begged for the man who had looked her in the eye 38 years ago and promised to build a fortress that would keep her safe from the world. "You promised you would always protect me, Frederick." She wept, her hands finally gripping the lapels of my suit. "You promised you would never let us lose everything. We built this life together. You cannot just delete it and let me go to prison for a mistake." I did not know Connor was a corporate spy. I was just trying to secure a legacy for our daughter. "You have to forgive me. Please, Frederick, save your family." I listened to her desperate monologue without interrupting a single syllable. I analyzed her plea with the exact same clinical detachment I used to hunt down Connor's malicious code. She was not crying because she regretted betraying me. She was crying because she had lost the game. She was mourning the $12 million payout, not the destruction of our marriage. I reached up and gently but firmly removed her trembling hands from my coat. I did not raise my voice. I did not show her a single ounce of the righteous anger that had fueled my survival over the last 35 days. I spoke with a quiet, lethal finality that completely silenced her weeping. "I kept my promise, Patricia," I stated smoothly. "I spent 40 years bleeding into those servers to build an impenetrable fortress for you and Vanessa. I protected you from every financial hardship, every market crash, and every ruthless competitor that tried to bankrupt us. I protected you flawlessly until the exact moment you decided to open the gates and hand the keys to a thief. You were not trying to secure a legacy for our daughter. You were entirely consumed by your own ego. You wanted the prestige of a massive corporate acquisition, and you were willing to manufacture federal embezzlement charges against your own husband to get it. You looked me in the eye and called me a bitter, obsolete old man in front of 50 employees because my presence inconvenienced your greed. You chose to trust a 26-year-old mercenary over the man who pulled you out of poverty." I stepped slightly closer to her, ensuring she heard every single word of my final judgment. "You are not a victim of a corporate spy, Patricia. Connor did not force you to freeze my bank accounts. He did not force you to sign a federal injunction locking me out of my own life. He did not force you to parade me through the lobby like a common criminal. You executed those betrayals voluntarily because you traded your dignity and your loyalty for the promise of a massive payout. You broke the foundation of this family, and now you must live in the rubble. I am not going to write a single line of code to save you." Patricia stared at me in absolute horrified silence. The last desperate shred of hope completely drained from her eyes. She finally realized that the unbreakable safety net she had taken for granted for nearly 4 decades was permanently gone. I turned away from her, pulled the heavy steel handle of my vintage truck, and climbed into the driver's seat. I shut the door firmly, physically severing the connection between us. I turned the key, and the heavy diesel engine roared to life, vibrating with a steady, reliable power. I shifted into gear and pulled away from the curb. I looked in my rearview mirror one last time. Patricia was standing entirely alone in the center of the vast, empty parking lot. Behind her, the towering glass walls of Vanguard Data Logistics stood like a massive, hollow tombstone for a completely bankrupt empire. I drove out of the industrial park and merged onto the open highway. The heavy weight of the past 38 years lifted entirely from my shoulders. I was driving toward a future that belonged to absolutely no one but myself. I needed to meet with Brian and my core engineering team. We had a new legacy to build. I drove my vintage truck across the city, navigating away from the grim industrial park and heading straight toward the vibrant commercial district on the west side. I parked in front of a newly leased, expansive brick building with massive reinforced windows. I walked through the heavy glass double doors and was immediately greeted by the brilliant sterile glow of overhead LED lights and the distinct sharp scent of fresh paint and ozone. Brian and my core team of senior engineers were already inside. They had not wasted a single minute since walking out of the hostile Vanguard headquarters. They were methodically unboxing high-performance server racks, weaving thick bundles of fiber optic cables, and establishing the physical framework for our brand-new digital infrastructure. I walked to the center of the open floor and placed my black leather briefcase onto a pristine steel workstation. I withdrew the heavily encrypted solid-state drive containing my complete proprietary routing algorithms. Brian stepped forward holding a master connection cable. We did not offer each other emotional speeches. We communicated with the synchronized efficiency of men who had just survived a brutal corporate war together. I plugged the drive into the primary terminal and typed in my master decryption keys. The large screens across the room instantly illuminated with cascading lines of flawless green code. The logistics software that had securely governed global supply chains for decades breathed life into our entirely new network. We officially launched our new enterprise, naming it Ironclad Data Solutions. We built it without corporate leeches, without manipulative executives, and without a single shred of dead weight. The architecture was entirely our own, completely insulated from external greed. I watched the data stream stabilize across the network monitors, confirming our absolute operational readiness. The global shipping market is absolutely ruthless, but it profoundly respects reliability and technical perfection. The exact moment Ironclad Data Solutions officially went live, my encrypted phone began to ring. The very first call came directly from Robert, the chief executive officer of the massive international retail chain, whose supply lines had been temporarily paralyzed by Connor and his catastrophic ransomware failure. I explained to him exactly what had transpired over the past 5 weeks. I laid out the absolute security guarantees of our new modernized infrastructure. Robert did not hesitate for a single second. He immediately terminated his pending contracts with the dissolving remnants of Vanguard and transferred his entire global portfolio directly to Ironclad. Within 48 hours, an unprecedented market shift occurred across the industry. The major international shipping conglomerates, the federal freight agencies, and the massive commercial distributors followed Robert and his exact lead. They recognized that the true value of their logistics network never resided in the physical trucks or the polished boardrooms Patricia had fought so viciously to control. The absolute value resided entirely in my integrity and my flawless engineering. They migrated their massive accounts to our highly secure servers with overwhelming speed. The influx of immediate liquid capital was astronomically high. Within our very first month of operation, Ironclad Data Solutions completely eclipsed the highest quarterly profit margins I had ever achieved in my 40 years of business. I distributed equitable partnership shares to Brian and the rest of my loyal engineering team, ensuring their financial futures were permanently secured. We were no longer just surviving a hostile corporate takeover. We were absolutely dominating the entire logistics industry on our own terms. We set a new standard for data security that our rivals could not possibly match or replicate. While my new empire thrived and expanded, the catastrophic consequences of boundless greed completely devoured the people who had betrayed me. The federal justice system moved with brutal, unyielding efficiency against my former family. Connor attempted to negotiate a favorable plea deal by offering to testify against his handlers at Apex Dynamics, but the federal prosecutors did not need his pathetic cooperation. The crystal-clear audio recording I provided secured his immediate and undeniable conviction. He is currently serving a mandatory 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary for corporate espionage and interstate wire fraud. Patricia faced absolute financial annihilation. The massive civil lawsuits from angry clients and the devastating federal fines for gross corporate negligence completely drained her remaining hidden assets. The bank officially foreclosed on the sprawling 5-bedroom house I had purchased with my own sweat. She was forced to declare severe, inescapable bankruptcy. She now lives in a cramped, dark, 1-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city, stripped entirely of the unearned luxury and false prestige she once flaunted so proudly. Vanessa and her reality shattered with equal severity. She swiftly divorced her imprisoned husband, but the financial damage was already permanent. Connor had successfully drained her entire private savings before his dramatic arrest. She is currently struggling to navigate a ruthless job market with absolutely no financial safety net to catch her. My private phone occasionally registers desperate voicemails from both of them. They cry, they apologize profusely, and they beg for my financial salvation. I look at the glowing notifications on my screen and I feel absolutely nothing. I press the delete button without listening to a single second of their pleas. They are completely erased from my life, existing only as a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition. I poured a fresh cup of bitter black coffee and walked slowly toward the expansive floor-to-ceiling window of my new corner office. The bright morning sunlight poured over the bustling city skyline, illuminating a world full of endless untapped possibilities. I stood quietly, letting the comforting warmth soak into my skin. I am 70 years old. Society often dictates that an African-American man my age should quietly step aside, surrender his hard-earned power, and fade invisibly into the background. My own family believed I was an obsolete relic they could simply discard for a quick corporate payout. They fundamentally misunderstood the core nature of a true engineer. We do not break when the system fails around us. We isolate the corrupted code, extract the malicious malware, and rebuild the structural foundation infinitely stronger than it was before. I lost a wife who viewed me merely as a disposable financial asset. I lost a daughter who allowed blind greed to completely override her familial loyalty. But in shedding that immense, suffocating dead weight from my shoulders, I regained my absolute independence. I look out over the city knowing I hold total control over my own destiny. I am standing at the pinnacle of a highly lucrative industry surrounded by brilliant colleagues who deeply respect my leadership and honor our shared history. I took a slow, measured sip of my coffee, savoring the profound silence of my pristine office. The hostile takeover is a distant memory. The betrayals have been fully and ruthlessly avenged. I am unbroken, I am incredibly wealthy, and for the first time in my entire adult life, I am completely free. I built an impenetrable fortress that no one will ever compromise again. The silent adjustment is complete.